Michelle Marie Fisher was born in 1977 on Long Island, New York. The eldest daughter in the family, she was always organized, judicious, and eager for stability. Her school diaries were neatly lined with underlined headings, and her favorite subjects were math and social studies. Her parents, Tom and Linda Fisher, recall that she didn't tolerate clutter in her room or in her life. Her goal was clear from an early age: to succeed. In 1995, at the age of 18, Michelle moved to Raleigh to attend North Carolina State University. She enrolled in accounting and finance, a major that required pedantry and precision, a perfect fit for her personality. During her freshman year, she was a cheerleader. Her coordinated movements, teamwork, and energy all complemented her analytical mindset. In 1997, her sophomore year, her life took its first unexpected turn. On a night out with her friends to the Have a Nice Day Cafe Club in downtown Raleigh, she spotted a tall guy with a careless smile in the audience. His name was Jason Lin Young. According to her friends' recollections, she literally dragged him to the dance floor. "Come on, let's show these nerds how it's done," she joked, and off they went. With this dance and began the story of the young couple's life together. Jason was a completely different person, open, charismatic, more of a dreamer than a planner. He was fond of sports but was not committed to the regime. He studied at the same university but in a different department. They became a contrasting couple, pragmatic Michelle and impulsive Jason, and, as it often happens, opposites attracted. Their relationship developed rapidly but without too much drama. At least from the outside, everything looked calm. After graduating in 1999, Michelle began working in her specialty, first at a small firm and then at Progress Energy, where she was quickly promoted to senior financial consultant in the tax department. Jason was looking for himself at the time. He tried several fields before landing a job in sales. In October 2003, they were married. The wedding was memorable. Their dog, Jason's rescued dog, delivered the rings at the ceremony in a small church near Raleigh. Everything seemed to work out for them. In 2004, their daughter Cassidy was born, a blonde-haired, smiling girl whom Michelle adored. In their house appeared children's furniture, soft toys, family photos in frames on the walls. In 2005, they bought a $379,000 0-cents two-story home in a quiet Enchanted Oaks neighborhood. Plans were being made for the future. But in May 2006, a disturbing episode occurred. Jason and Michelle were involved in a car accident near Brevard, a town in the western part of the state. Their Mitsubishi veered off the road, rolled down a slope, and ended up half in a river. Michelle was pregnant at the time. She lost the baby shortly after the accident. The traffic police inspector who examined the scene at the time found no signs of malfunction or suspicious circumstances. Nevertheless, in the summer of 2006, life went on. Jason got a promotion. He started working for a company developing software for medical institutions. His earnings increased, and Michelle was going to transfer to a part-time position so she could spend more time with her daughter. She was pregnant again, this time with a boy. Michelle continued to plan as she always had. She had spreadsheets of expenses, a shopping list for the newborn, even a rough plan for a bedroom remodel. But shadows were appearing in their relationship, according to those close to them. Michelle complained to her sister, Meredith, that Jason was leaving more often, spending time traveling, and had recently traveled to California alone without her and the baby. She was angry. The family discussed financial difficulties, and Michelle herself felt a lack of support. On the evening of November 2, 2006, Jason left on a business trip to Virginia, claiming he had a work meeting. He then planned to stop by his mother and stepfather's house in Brevard. He checked into a hotel in Hillsville, where he recorded his arrival. The next morning, November 3, he sent a text message to Michelle's sister, Meredith Fisher. He asked her to come by the house and pick up some document or item. The wording was vague but not alarming. Meredith arrived around 1:30 p.m. The door was closed but not locked. The house was quiet. When Meredith went up to the second floor and entered the bedroom, she froze. There was her sister lying on the floor, unmoving, face down. The room felt heavy, as if the air had thickened. "Michelle?" she called out. There was no answer. Cassidy, a 2-year-old girl, peeked out from under the sheets of her parents' bed and, looking at her aunt, asked, "Why isn't Mommy waking up?" Meredith rushed to the phone to call emergency services. 22 minutes later, at 2:04 p.m., the first patrol car arrived at the house on Birchleaf Drive. It was followed by a forensic team and members of the Wake County Sheriff's Office Crime Lab. Entry to the property was immediately restricted, and the area around the house was cordoned off with tape. The complainant was already on site. Her status as a relative was confirmed. She was in a state of shock, but was able to provide a basic introduction to the incident. The house was a 2-story brick structure with an attached garage. In front of the front door were children's toys, including a tricycle and a small rocking chair. Inside, there were signs of an orderly daily life, neat furniture, clothes in closets, children's drawings, and photographs on the walls. There were no signs of forced entry, damage to the front door, or broken windows. The body of a woman, later identified as Michelle Marie Young, age 29, was discovered on the second floor in the master bedroom. The body was in a face-down position on the carpet next to the bed. Visually, there were numerous signs of bruising and injuries to the head area. The clothes were partially crumpled. Blood had spread to the floor, adjacent wall, and part of the bedding. Initial examination revealed multiple injuries, the nature of which indicated significant mechanical impact. In the hand of the deceased was clenched a blood clot with an admixture of light hair. Nearby on the floor there was a print of a bare foot, partially covered with blood, as well as a footprint of shoes, presumably about 11 US in size. In an adjoining room, under a blanket on the parents' bed, the deceased's 2-year-old daughter was found. The girl was conscious, physically unharmed. Her behavior indicated a prolonged stay in the room with her mother's body. The room where the crime occurred had no signs of active struggle. There was no overturned furniture, broken objects, or broken doors. However, experts noticed that there were no signs of theft. All valuables, wallet, cell phone, laptop, jewelry, were in their places. Criminalists concluded that the murder was not accompanied by a robbery motive. On the floor, in addition to traces of blood, there were 2 clear shoe prints in the lower left corner of the room. Blood was also found on the bathroom doorknob as well as on a towel hanging on a coat rack. Presumably, the killer was trying to clean himself of the evidence of the crime. Traces of water in the sink confirmed that someone had washed their hands or face immediately after the incident. Investigators checked all windows, exits, and attic spaces. None were open or damaged. The conclusion based on this evidence is that entry to the home was either through an unlocked door or with the use of a key. Over the next 3 hours, investigators interviewed Meredith Fisher, the sister of the deceased, who had arrived at the house at Jason Young's request. According to her, the day before the tragedy, he had gone on a business trip and, while out of town, asked her to run a minor errand at the house. Upon arriving at the location, she went inside as the door was unlocked. Upon discovering her sister's body, she immediately called the police. Information was also received that 24 hours prior to the incident, on the evening of November 2, Jason Young had left for Hillsville, Virginia, allegedly to meet with a client. On the morning of November 3, he planned to continue on to Brevard, where his mother resided. At the hotel where he was staying, staff confirmed that he checked in around 10:40 p.m., but surveillance video was unavailable due to an equipment outage in the south wing of the hotel. This fact was recorded in the report as potentially significant. On November 4, 2006, Jason Young returned to Raleigh. His family members arrived with him. He entered the house around 11 o'clock IEM, accompanied by officers. Upon arrival, he was informed of the death of his spouse. After a brief discussion with detectives, he stated his intention to seek legal assistance. He contacted an attorney the following day, at which time he declined further interaction with police. Investigating officers documented his behavior as reserved but not suspicious. Nevertheless, the fact that he was uncooperative was noted as potentially important in the context of assessing his involvement. By the end of November 4, the investigation team had an initial set of facts in hand to form an early version of what had happened. It was determined that Michelle Young was found dead in the master bedroom of her own home, with multiple injuries characteristic of blunt force trauma to the head. An examination of the scene showed no signs of forced entry. All doors and windows were intact and valuables were in their places, which ruled out a robbery motive. Of particular note was the fact that their 2-year-old daughter had been in the room with the body for a long time, physically unharmed but subjected to serious psychological stress. A shoe print was recorded next to the victim's body, and a hair tangled in dried blood was found in the victim's hand. The time of death was tentatively determined to be the night or early morning of Nov 3. Despite the spouse's claim that he was in another city, there was no supporting videotape of him at the hotel, which raised reasonable doubt. Thus, the picture of the incident was gradually building towards a carefully planned domestic crime. The preliminary analysis considered the house as an isolated crime scene with limited access. Taking into account the closed nature of the house and the absence of traces of penetration, the investigators put forward the primary version. The crime was committed by someone who had access to the dwelling and was well aware of the layout of the premises. Interviews with neighbors were initiated. Several residents reported that they did not hear any suspicious sounds or movement on the night of November 2 to 3. There were no outdoor surveillance cameras in the neighborhood, making it much more difficult to verify vehicle routes. By the end of the week, the investigative team began a full analysis of the digital traces, calls, messages, and internet browsing history. Forensic scientists continued to work on the full report, including toxicology and DNA tests. During the investigation phase, in the absence of an obvious motivated intruder and with no evidence of forced entry or theft, the suspect pool was narrowed. The investigation focused on individuals who had legitimate access to the home and personal intimacy with the deceased. Jason Young, Michelle's husband, automatically became the focus of attention, not by formal status, but because of a set of circumstances that were beginning to form a consistent chain. Although his physical location on the night of the alleged crime was claimed to be a hotel in Hillsville, Virginia, police were faced with a lack of reliable video confirmation. Surveillance cameras in the wing of the hotel where he was staying appeared to be turned off that night. This meant that despite the registration, investigators had no objective evidence to confirm his continuous overnight stay. This alibi gap was immediately recorded in the materials as critical for further analysis. The key elements were the physical evidence found at the scene. In the bedroom where Michelle's body was located, experts recorded several shoe prints left in partially dried blood. Their shape and tread made it possible to judge the model and approximate size of the shoes. The forensic laboratory used three-dimensional scanning of the footprints and compared them with shoe product databases. As a result, the prints were found to be a complete match to Hush Puppy's model Orbit sneakers size 11. During a search of Jason Young's personal property conducted as part of the warrant, a pair of similar model sneakers with signs of recent use was found among his shoes. Experts seized the sneakers for comparative analysis, which confirmed that the sole pattern and wear matched the prints found at the scene. The micro-traces found on the soles included microparticles of fibers similar to those found on the bedroom carpet. These coincidences allowed the investigation to include this element in the cumulative pattern of material evidence. In addition, a hair entangled in a blood clot was clasped in the left hand of the deceased. Its origin was not doubted by the criminalists. In length, color, and structure, it did not correspond to Michelle's hair. The hair was seized and sent for DNA analysis. Samples taken from Jason Young with his consent, at an early stage before his refusal to cooperate, were used for comparison. The result of the analysis was unequivocal. The hair found was a genetic match to Jason's sample. An additional element was the examination of a vehicle, a Ford Explorer owned by the Young family. In the trunk compartment and on the rear mat were recorded traces of brownish-red color, which visually corresponded to traces of blood. Laboratory forensics confirmed that it was human blood that matched the DNA profile of Michelle Young. The concentration was low, indicating traces of transfer, possibly in the transportation of items contaminated by the crime. Taken together, all of these findings, shoe prints, genetic material, and blood traces, not only indicated possible involvement, but also demonstrated that there was direct physical contact between Jason and the crime scene during the time period of Michelle's alleged time of death. The next area of work was digital forensics. Jason's seized laptop and mobile device were turned over to the digital forensics unit. Among the recovered data were search queries made in the weeks before the tragedy. Of particular note were phrases entered into search engines such as anatomy of a knockout, head trauma and loss of consciousness, as well as North Carolina divorce and life after divorce with child. The fact that these inquiries were present, combined with the circumstances of the incident, was seen as an important element in shaping the motivational model. Although the queries alone could not be evidence of guilt, they added depth to the psychological profile of the suspect, indicating possible thoughts and interest in topics directly related to physical harm. Data was also recovered on the user's activities on the night of the crime. No activity was recorded on the laptop and phone between 23 o'clock and 5 o'clock, which coincided with the suspected window of time of the crime. GPS data from the navigator from the car did not contain a route indicating movement, but its history had been partially deleted, requiring additional recovery and raising suspicions of attempted concealment of information. The decisive factor in strengthening the investigation's version was the result of the forensic examination of Michelle Young's body, conducted in January 2007. Specialists determined that the cause of death was multiple head injuries. The experts concluded that the blows were inflicted by an object with a hard surface, having a rounded shape, most likely not a sharp instrument. The nature of the injuries indicated the repeated application of force exceeding the threshold sufficient for loss of consciousness. The body also showed signs of compression in the neck area. Taken together, this made it possible to assert that, in addition to the blows, an element of strangulation had been applied. The expert examination did not reveal signs of violent actions of a sexual nature, which made it possible to exclude certain versions of the crime. The total number of inflicted injuries in the head area exceeded 30, but forensic specialists refrained from precise quantification of active phases of impact, referring to the presence of overlapping hematomas. Additionally, no signs of struggle or self-defense were recorded, suggesting either the suddenness of the attack or the victim's inability to resist. The absence of marks in other rooms indicated that the attack occurred directly in the bedroom and within a confined space. By the early spring of 2007, the investigation had a sufficiently large body of evidence to reasonably consider Jason Young as the primary suspect. At the same time, the police were in no hurry to make an arrest. All actions were conducted with the utmost care, as there was no direct motive for the crime and the case initially had no obvious signs of a simple domestic conflict. The police realized that Jason could evade justice, citing the incompetence of the staff. Because, for example, to find Jason's hair in the house where he lived, it is quite possible to leave traces of shoes is also possible, because it was in the same house, in the closet. There was enough evidence to form a reasonable suspicion, but not enough for an immediate indictment. The investigators acted in stages, accumulating evidence that together could withstand legal and judicial scrutiny. Particular attention was paid to forensic details, digital traces, genetic matches, and expert testimony that together built a clear chain of causation. After months of work, hundreds of pages of reports, dozens of forensic examinations, and an accumulation of evidence, the case of Michelle Young's death was nearing its logical conclusion. Despite the lingering suspicion against Jason Young, the investigation was careful to avoid premature action. The main challenge was to assemble not just a hypothesis, but a legally complete construct capable of withstanding the test of a court of law. By May 2008, investigators had a solid block of evidence at their disposal. Jason's DNA at the crime scene, his shoe prints in the blood, traces of Michelle's blood in his car, and digital evidence, search terms indicating an interest in themes of violence and trauma. All of this shaped the technical side of the case. However, the key elements that contributed to the decision to prosecute were the clues to motive that uncovered in parallel with the forensic investigation. Beginning in the early summer of 2006, internal tensions began to build between Jason and Michelle. According to the data collected through interviews with relatives, colleagues, and acquaintances of the couple, it turned out that Michelle repeatedly expressed concern about the behavior of her spouse. It was known in her entourage that Jason began to spend more and more time away from home, explaining it by the need for constant business trips. However, as the subsequent audit showed, not all the trips were related to professional activities. Some of the trips were not supported by official documents, and this led the investigation to take a closer look into the personal life of the suspect. Through the recovery of correspondence, telephone connections, and email analysis, it was established that Jason had a long relationship with a woman who lived in Florida. Her name is Michelle Manny. She had previously been acquainted with Michelle Young through the student body. Although the woman was married, a relationship developed between her and Jason that was at least emotionally intimate in nature. Communication between the two was particularly active in the months leading up to Michelle's death. This included late-night phone calls, making future plans together, and discussing personal topics, including Jason's dissatisfaction with the marriage. Prosecutors will argue in the future that the relationship with Manny played a role in shaping Jason's internal attitude of getting rid of the obstacle of a wife and enhancing personal freedom. The second key factor was the substantial insurance coverage written on Michelle Young's life. According to the contracts, she had 2 active insurance policies with a combined face value of $1 million. According to the insurance company, these policies were renewed and extended in the 6 months prior to her death. The insurance information was established as part of a civil lawsuit filed by Michelle's mother in the fall of 2008. That lawsuit, classified as a wrongful death case, allowed family representatives to request access to Jason's financial and personal records. As part of that process, the judge ruled in December 2008 that based on the materials presented, there is a sufficient basis to establish Jason Young's liability for the death of his wife. The court also ruled that he was not entitled to claim insurance benefits. The ruling, although handed down in a civil case, gave new impetus to the criminal investigation. Investigators used the court's findings to finalize the legal drafting of the indictment. On December 14, 2009, 37 months after Michelle's death, a Wake County grand jury indicted Jason Young for first-degree murder. The language indicated premeditation and the presence of aggravating factors. One of the arguments in favor of the charge was that the suspect disconnected the hotel's security cameras in advance to create a fictitious alibi and then drove to Raleigh at night, traveled 270 miles, committed the crime, and returned by morning. The arrest was made in the morning hours at the suspect's temporary residence in North Carolina. The operation went unopposed. Jason Young was transported to the detention center at the county jail. His rights were explained to him, and he was given access to his attorney that same day. From that point forward, all further interactions with law enforcement went exclusively through the defense. The public reaction to the arrest was resonant. The case, which had been in the media spotlight since the discovery of the body, received a new wave of coverage. The public watched with interest as the case turned from a family drama into a criminal trial with a wide range of evidence. Michelle's family expressed support for the actions of the investigation. Representatives of the prosecutor's office emphasized that the decision to arrest was made on the basis of a lengthy collection of evidence, confirmed both materially and expertly. Taking into account the complexity and emotional burden of the case, it was decided to prepare for the trial in stages, involving specialists in the field of criminal psychology, digital expertise, and forensic medicine. Thus, Jason Young's arrest was the logical conclusion of a nearly 3-year investigation. It was not based on confessions or random incriminating testimony, but was the result of a slow and carefully constructed case, where every piece of evidence, from microtrace to bank paper, had its strictly defined place. What lay ahead was the most important test of all: the trial. A year and a half after the indictment, the first criminal trial of Jason Young took place in June 2011 at the Wake County Courthouse. The prosecution built its case on a body of circumstantial and physical evidence. DNA test results, a shoe print match, the discovery of Michelle's blood in the defendant's car, digital forensics data, search terms indicating a prior interest in the mechanics of the injuries, and facts related to his personal life and financial circumstances. The prosecution's theory was that the defendant, after checking into a hotel in Hillsville, Virginia, on the evening of November 2, 2006, soon left the hotel through a side exit, after first disabling the security cameras, and traveled by car to Raleigh. There, allegedly between midnight and early morning, he entered the home, killed his spouse, and fled the scene, leaving their 2-year-old daughter next to the body. According to the investigation, he then returned to the hotel and continued to his mother's house in Brevard, where he was supposed to be, according to the travel plan. Defense attorneys insisted there was no direct evidence. The lack of witnesses, an instrument of crime, video evidence of the route, and an undeniable motive were presented as key gaps in the prosecution's case. In addition, the defense emphasized that the fact of blood in the car could have been the result of domestic situations, and the shoe prints could have been the result of the defendant's earlier presence in the house. Jason Young himself took the stand, denying any involvement in the death of his spouse. He confirmed his stay at the hotel on the night of the tragedy and attributed the disconnected cameras to an accidental circumstance beyond his control. After several days of deliberations and more than 10 hours of deliberations, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. At the end of the vote, 8 jurors leaned toward acquittal, 4 toward a guilty plea. A mistrial was declared. The judge disbanded the jury and the case was remanded for retrial. The retrial took place in March 2012. It was organized based on the experience and mistakes of the previous trial. The prosecution supplemented its position with the results of the forensic examination and an extended chronology of the suspect's digital activity. Evidence was also presented to prove emotional and personal conflicts in the marriage, including evidence of an affair and the existence of a substantial insurance payout that the defendant could count on after his wife's death. The prosecutorial line emphasized Jason's actions before and after the alleged crime, emphasizing selectivity in his communications, deletion of data, and lack of cooperation after returning to Raleigh. The defense again focused on the insufficiency of the evidence, its circumstantial nature, and the possibility of alternative interpretations. This time, however, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. After 3 days of deliberations and 11 hours of deliberations, a final verdict was rendered. On March 6, 2012, the Circuit Court of Wake County found Jason Lynn Young guilty of the crime of first-degree intentional homicide against his wife, Michelle Marie Young. On March 7, 2012, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In a photo Jennifer Rothwell posted to her Instagram 2 weeks before she disappeared, she's smiling to backdrop the maple trees, a knit sweater, her husband over her shoulders. The caption reads, "The little moments are the most important." No one, not even their closest friends, would suspect that something was going wrong in this couple's life. But it is from such seemingly flawless stories that the darkest dramas are often born. It all started with silence. Jennifer stopped making contact on the evening of November 12, 2019. She didn't return home, didn't respond to her mother's texts, didn't show up for work. Her husband didn't report her missing until the night before, a delay that would later become a key detail of the investigation. And a week later, a body was found 72 kilometers from their home, in a wooded area along a country road. Female, 6 weeks pregnant, Jennifer. Jennifer Lynn Von Hausen was born on February 15, 1991, in St. Charles, Missouri. She grew up as the only child in the family of Robin and Gregory Von Hausen. Her parents remembered her as a thoughtful, mature, beyond her years. When she was 8, she was already writing her own shopping lists and watching the expiration dates on milk, her mother said. In school, Jennifer was distinguished by diligence, math, chemistry, participation in Olympiads, and school science clubs. After graduation, she entered the University of Missouri, where she majored in chemistry. Purposeful, serious, not prone to excessive drama, this is how her fellow students remember her. After college, she landed a position with a large chemical technology company in St. Louis, analyzing production samples and certifying products. The job required pedantry, which was exactly what she loved. She'd met Bo Rothwell through mutual acquaintances at a reunion. Tall, smiling, confident. He sold medical equipment, could hold a conversation, joked, and made a good impression on her parents. Their romance developed rapidly, dating, traveling, meeting families. A year later, they moved in together, and in 2015, they got married. The wedding was chamber but soulful, by the lake, in a narrow circle. At first, everything seemed harmonious. Together, they chose a house in Krifkera, a cozy suburb with green streets and the noise of dragonflies in the summer evenings. Jennifer enjoyed the garden, dreamed of children, kept a calendar on the refrigerator where she carefully marked important days. Bo, she said, was supportive of her endeavors, even though he was often busy with work. From the outside, it looked like a normal young family building a future together. But in 2019, something changed. Jennifer began to notice that Bo was coming home later, answering one-wordly, distancing himself. In the spring, she informed him of the pregnancy, 6 weeks. She expected a reaction, tears, joy, but as she later wrote in a correspondence with a friend, he just shut up. Did he show fear, anger, disappointment? There were no answers. As time went on, the situation worsened. Jennifer began waking up more often at night, anxious, withdrawn. According to her coworkers, she was often distracted at work, losing concentration, but still continued to maintain the image, punctual, delicate, professional. Friend Sandra recalled, it was as if she lived between two worlds, in public, calm, collected, and in private, as if she couldn't find the ground beneath her feet. On the morning of November 12, 2019, Jennifer arrived at work as usual. Colleagues remembered that she was particularly quiet, barely participating in discussions. At approximately 5 p.m., she left the office and never returned. When Jennifer didn't show up at home by late afternoon, her mother became concerned. She tried to call, but the phone was disconnected. It would later turn out that Bo was at home. He took no action for several hours. It was only after midnight that he reported his wife missing to the police. Even then, reports would indicate that the man looked not fully concerned and gave a story with a vague timeline. The next morning, Jennifer's family sprang into action. Her picture appeared on Facebook, support groups were formed, co-workers joined search parties, police officially declared the woman missing. Bo took part in the search, saying the right words, helping to put up posters, standing next to Jennifer's parents as they spoke to the press. From the moment Jennifer Rothwell didn't come home on the evening of November 12, 2019, there was a silent, growing unease in her family. Her phone was disconnected. There were no messages. She didn't show up for work the next day. To some, this behavior might seem like an impulsive act under stress, but not to Jennifer. Her mother, Robin von Hausen, was the first to worry. She said Jennifer always kept her family informed, sometimes even in excessive detail. "I'm on my way to the store. I'll be right back home. Got to the parking lot before it rained." Such messages were the norm for her. Simple, routine phrases, but they were a sign of constant presence, attentiveness, and connection. Jennifer never disappeared to nowhere. Jennifer's senior lab colleague, Rachel Kincaid, confirmed this to investigators. She always gave a warning if she was late, even if it was 10 minutes, and here, nothing. Her friends haven't heard a word from her either. Social media silence, phone off. Jennifer seemed to have vanished. Given that the woman was 6 weeks pregnant, the anxiety among her family doubled. Robin called Bo that evening around 8 p.m. to ask if everything was okay. Bo said he couldn't reach Jennifer, but believed that she might have stayed at a friend's house or just decided to be alone. Robin hung up with a feeling that something was wrong. At midnight, Bo contacted the police himself and reported her missing. The next morning, investigators from the Creve Coeur Police Department got involved. The first hours after a disappearance are the most critical. Detectives began by interviewing family and friends. Everyone, without exception, said the same thing. Jennifer's disappearance was unlike her. Her mother, father, colleagues, university friends all emphasized her pedantic, organized, stable nature. Jennifer was not prone to emotional outbursts, did not leave the house, did not disappear amid quarrels. Close friend Sandra Levy testified, "She and I had talked literally within a day. She was discussing what color curtains to choose for the nursery. Everything was very calm. There was no sign that she wanted to disappear or run away." The police began to work out theories: accident, kidnapping, voluntary departure. But the more that became clear about Jennifer's lifestyle, the faster the last theory faded away. On No. 13, around 9 a.m., police officers arrived at the house at 1234 North Ballas Road, the Rothwell family's residential address. The house was in good condition: neat facade, fresh paint, well-maintained yard. Bo met them in person. He was dressed in a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair disheveled, circles under his eyes. There was a look of anxiety on his face, but not panic. He was cooperative, let the police in, and consented to a search of the premises. Bo said he left home for work around 8 a.m. on November 12, and when he returned that evening, Jennifer was gone. There was no answer to her phone, and he could not find her car in the driveway or nearby. He said she hadn't left a note or talked about plans for the evening. He said she had been feeling tired and worried about the pregnancy lately, but he hadn't noticed anything threatening in her behavior. At first, everything in the house seemed calm. The kitchen was clean, the living room was tidy. In the bedroom, the bed was made. On the dressing table were the usual items: a comb, cosmetics, a bottle of perfume. However, the attentive eyes of the investigators began to notice nuances. The first thing that caused the officers doubt was the pungent odor of detergents, especially in the hall and in one of the rooms on the second floor. There was an acrid odor in the room, a mixture of chlorine and bleach. Everything looked sterile, perhaps even too sterile. The carpet at the entrance to the laundry room caught my eye. A gray-beige, dense, long-pile carpet. It was slightly damp, and the police noticed faint stains that showed through even the bleach. At first glance, it might have appeared to be just marks from a spilled drink or shoe mud, but experts who arrived later took note. The pattern of the stains indicated the possible presence of blood. Bo explained that he had recently cut his finger and may have accidentally soiled the carpet and then tried to clean it with household chemicals. However, detectives examining the scene noticed that the stains were not in one spot, but were arranged as if someone had dragged or moved an object or body. Moreover, they found traces of bleach and crumpled napkins in the toilet bowl in the laundry room. It was decided to seize the carpeting and send it for laboratory analysis to determine the exact nature of the substance and its origin. In addition, a low-visibility mark resembling a blow or headbutt stain was found on the wall near the staircase to the lower floor. It was at the level of an adult's head. Bo was on his best behavior. He answered questions, did not object to the inspection of the premises, showed where everything was. He even offered to print out pictures of Jennifer and post them in neighborhoods where he said she could be. He participated in an impromptu press conference addressing his wife. "If you can hear me, please let me know you're okay." However, experienced investigators knew sincerity can be too smooth. Police Lieutenant Kreithker later said, "He never allowed a single emotional breakdown. It was a strange thing. Even people with cold temperaments break down in such situations. He didn't." After inspecting the house, the police decided not to press charges. There were too few facts, too much uncertainty. But the odor, the wet carpet, the bleach residue, and Bo's explanations that didn't quite fit the big picture were all recorded and filed as grounds for an in-depth investigation. The materials were sent to the state lab for analysis. It was necessary to determine whether the traces found were indeed blood, and if so, whose blood it was. At the same time, investigators requested access to the browser history of the computers in the house and began checking Jennifer's phone activity. When a person disappears and the evidence points to neither violent behavior nor voluntary departure, the investigation begins to resemble moving in a fog. Each movement of the investigation requires caution, patience, and the ability to discern subtle signals. In the Jennifer Rothwell case, it was this uncertainty that became the first and foremost obstacle. By the time the analysis of the carpet from the Rothwell home was not yet complete, the investigative team remained in limbo. Jennifer was listed as missing, not a crime victim. Evidence was scarce, no body found, no witnesses. The psychological profile of the missing woman gave no reason to believe that she could have left on her own. Jennifer was responsible, disciplined, did not tell anyone about her anxieties that could provoke an escape. In this situation, the police worked on two main fronts. The first was forensic analysis of the materials seized from the house. The second was working with digital data. Phones, computers, social media accounts, search queries. Since the investigation had no direct evidence of a crime, any of these areas could both lead to a trail and finally close the case due to lack of corpus delicti. At first, Bo Rothwell did not raise any obvious suspicions. He willingly talked to investigators, expressed concerns, attended voluntary searches. He showed up at press conferences, printed flyers, stood next to Jennifer's mother, and nodded when she said, "My daughter is not the type to go quietly. Something happened to her." The only thing disconcerting was his lack of a pronounced emotional response. He didn't cry, didn't get hysterical. He didn't demand immediate action from the police. His calm was almost impenetrable. Investigating Officer Allison Gray, who worked at this stage, later said, "He was neither cold nor warm, just blank, like he was distancing himself from reality." However, human behavior under stress is subjective. Some cling to the illusion of control, others break down. Bo's emotional stability could be a defense mechanism. From an investigative standpoint, he could neither be blamed nor ruled out. In the absence of a body, the investigators' main hope was to analyze digital data. With court authorization, they gained access to Jennifer's email, messenger accounts, and computer. In her browser, they found the usual requests: recipes for pregnant women, advice on planning maternity leave, recommendations for taking vitamins. Everything indicated that she was focused on the future and wasn't planning any drastic steps. However, one request stood out from this picture. It was made about a week before the disappearance and read, "What to do if your husband is angry because you are pregnant." This line, typed into Google at 10:47 p.m. on the evening Bo was home, was the first emotional alarm that came not from words but from actions. Investigators recorded the exact time, the IP address, the account. It was Jennifer's computer, and the request clearly reflected her internal state. Additionally, her correspondence with a friend captured a passage sent the day before she disappeared. "Sometimes he looks at me like I've done something terrible. He is distant. I don't know if he loves me now." For the investigation, all this was not yet proof, but it was already the basis for an assumption. Something was going on in the family, and perhaps the internal conflict had repercussions. A few days later, the lab returned the results of a blood sample found on the bleach-soaked carpet. The sample didn't belong to Bo Rothwell. That meant one thing: his cut finger story was false. What's more, the volume and location of the blood traces ruled out a random incident. A blood spatter expert retained for consultation stated that the configuration of the stains and their distribution on the carpet fibers was more likely consistent with a body transfer or severe head trauma. This was no longer mere suspicious behavior. It was material evidence inconsistent with the homeowner's story. From that moment on, Bo Rothwell became an official suspect. But even then, the investigation still had limitations. There was no body. There was no apparent motive. There was no prior record of domestic violence, threats, or conflict that could have caused the murder. Everyone who knew the family described them as a quiet, normal couple. Yes, there was testimony of recent estrangement, but it still wasn't something that could be presented in court. The investigation continued to analyze Bo's digital behavior. A check of his phone revealed that in the weeks before his disappearance, he had been actively texting with a woman named Karen. As it turned out, he was having an affair with her. In the messages, Bo wrote, "It's not that simple. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to tell her." The affair was the first real motive investigators could look into. His wife's pregnancy, the strained relationship, the desire for a new beginning, it all began to add up to a more coherent picture. If there was a body, the case would be finalized. These facts combined to move the investigation from missing to possible murder, and Bo from troubled husband to full-fledged suspect. The final element remained: finding the body. As the investigation comes to its climax, details become key. Even the most seemingly insignificant, an object on a shelf, an odor in the room, a temporary shift in testimony, can turn out to be the links that connect the disparate parts into a single complete picture. That's exactly what happened in the Jennifer Rothwell case. After receiving the results of the forensic examination of bloodstains and digital evidence, the investigation was finally convinced that Jennifer's disappearance was of a violent nature. Given the accumulated facts, false explanations for the origin of the blood, pregnancy conflict, an affair on the side, investigators decided to conduct a secondary search of the Rothwell home. The second visit was court-ordered and conducted on November 18, 2019, 6 days after the woman's disappearance. This time, the investigative team did not go in blind as they did on the first visit, but with a clear understanding of what to look for. Particular attention was paid to the potential weapon of crime. During the inspection of the garage, one of the criminalists paid attention to the toolbox. Most of the items were in typical condition, traces of dust, rust, and wear and tear. But one object stood out: a hammer. The handle was plastic, the fastening was secure, the working part was steel polished to a mirror shine. Unusually clean, without a single trace of dust or oil, the tool lay in the drawer as if it had just been bought. This was a signal to the specialists. The tool had been washed deliberately and with special care. There was no everyday need for this. Nobody washes hammers with bleach. Sterile cleanliness of construction tools is rare and, in the context of what was happening, a clear anomaly. The object was immediately seized and sent for examination. At this point, the investigation had a coherent chain of logic. Bo's behavior in the final weeks before Jennifer's disappearance pointed to a personal and emotional crisis, a secret affair, the pressures of future fatherhood, alienation in his marriage. His story of his wife's disappearance began to unravel under the weight of the facts. She hadn't disappeared before he came home. On the contrary, she was home when he was already there. The blood on the carpet, the carefully cleaned hammer, the digital evidence, and the contradictions in the testimony added up to an obvious construct. There was only one thing missing: a confession or a body. One of the two to complete the process of qualifying the prosecution and move on to arrest. On November 20, 2019, Bo Rothwell was summoned for formal questioning. The venue was the Creve Coeur police station. As he was not formally arrested, the presence of a lawyer was not required. However, after the presentation of a number of facts, the atmosphere of the interrogation changed. Investigators showed him blood test results, pictures of the carpet, transcripts of Jennifer's digital requests, and printouts of messages indicating he was having an affair. This time, Rothwell couldn't resist the internal pressure. He partially pleaded guilty. According to him, on the day of the disappearance, he and Jennifer had a violent argument about his infidelity and her pregnancy. The emotional background, he explained, was tense. Jennifer accused him of betrayal, he of manipulation. In a moment of emotional breakdown, he grabbed a hammer and hit her. Rothwell claimed he did not plan the murder, but went into a red veil and lost control. He said that after the first blow, Jennifer tried to run away, but he followed her and struck a second one. What followed was panic. He didn't know if she was alive, couldn't call an ambulance, and decided to cover up what had happened. This account was inconsistent with his earlier statements that Jennifer had disappeared before he returned home. Thus, his lies were corroborated not only by the evidence but also by his own words. Based on the confession and the evidence already collected, police formally charged Bo Rothwell with 3 counts of first-degree murder, destruction of evidence, concealment of a body. He was taken into custody on the same day, November 20, 2019. At the request of the investigation, the court authorized his detention without the possibility of bail, given the severity of the crime and the risk of attempted flight. Following his arraignment and detention, investigators began an active search for the body. Up to that point, Rothwell had not named a location where Jennifer's body might have been taken. However, under the pressure of the new circumstances, he testified, indicating the area where he said he left her, a rural area in Lincoln County, about 72 kilometers northwest of the house. The following day, November 21, 2019, a search operation was deployed in the said area. Approximately 6 hours later, around 3:20 p.m., the body of a woman matching Jennifer's description was discovered in a roadside hollow, partially covered by foliage. Forensics later identified and confirmed that it was her. Forensics recorded 2 blunt force traumas to the head. The nature of the injuries were consistent with hammer blows, exactly as Bo described during his interrogation. There were no signs of prolonged exposure to water or fire. The body had not been attempted to be destroyed. It was simply abandoned, with no attempt at burial. This confirmed the assumption of the investigation. The crime was not planned, but premeditated. The cover-up was hasty and improvised. The investigation was concluded with full legal certainty of Bo Rothwell's guilt. The case file was turned over to the St. Louis County District Attorney's Office for preparation of a court indictment. Now the case was about to enter its next phase, the trial, where Rothwell would face a jury and answer for what he had done. The public, shocked by the story of the perfect couple and the sudden tragedy, watched every step of the drama with an attention that mixed bewilderment, anger, and grief. The trial of Bo Rothwell began in the spring of 2022 at the St. Louis County Courthouse. Interest in the hearings was high. The case was not just a murder but a tragedy involving a young pregnant woman who disappeared suddenly and was found dead a week later. The courtroom was packed with journalists, Jennifer's family, and members of the search teams that had once tried to find her alive. The prosecution was represented by District Attorney Wesley Bell. In his opening statement, he labeled the incident as a premeditated murder committed in the midst of family conflict. Amidst the pressure that Bo Rothwell was under because of his wife's pregnancy and his secret affair with another woman, the prosecutor emphasized that the defendant's actions after the crime left no doubt about their deliberation and direction. He tried to destroy traces, concealed the body, thoroughly washed the hammer, and misled the investigation. All this indicated a clear intention to evade responsibility. Among the evidence presented by the prosecution were forensic evidence of blood found on the carpet in the house, the results of a digital analysis of Jennifer's search activity, including the query, "What to do if your husband is angry about the pregnancy?" and the fact that Bo Rothwell had a romantic relationship on the side. The witnesses who came forward, Jennifer's mother, her friends and colleagues, described how in recent weeks the woman had become increasingly anxious and withdrawn, and there had been an alienation in her relationship with her husband. The court was also presented with the circumstances of the discovery of the body, its location, the nature of the blunt force trauma, and forensic reports comparing the nature of the injuries to the shape of the hammer found. The defense, on the other hand, argued that the crime was not premeditated. According to the defense lawyers, the couple had had a heated argument during which Bo lost control of himself, acted in a state of strong emotional excitement, and did not realize the consequences of his actions. The defendant himself appeared in court and admitted that he hit his wife on the head with a hammer. He stated that after the first blow, Jennifer tried to leave, but he, unable to restrain himself, struck again. After that, he allegedly did not understand whether she was alive or not, panicked, and committed what he later considered his main crime, tried to cover up what had happened. The defense insisted that it was a tragic outburst of anger, but not a calculation. But the defendant's actions after the fact, washing the hammer, using bleach, destroying evidence, engaging in a search for a seemingly disturbed spouse, said otherwise. Words and actions did not match, and prosecutors used this dissonance as a central argument in their strategy. Throughout the trial, Jennifer's mother, Robin von Hausen, was in the audience. She spoke no public words during the proceedings, but later told reporters in the hallway, "For him, it was a moment, and for us, an eternity without her." The emotions of other relatives were also contained, as if grief no longer had words, only silence. After several days of hearings and 8 hours of deliberation, the jury, 6 men and 6 women, returned with a verdict. Their verdict was unanimous. On April 28, 2022, the St. Louis County Circuit Court found Bo Rothwell guilty of first-degree murder, destruction of evidence, and concealing a human body. On July 1, 2022, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Heather Elvis was born on June 30, 1993 in Horry County, South Carolina. She was the eldest of two children in the family of Terry and Debbie Elvis. Her younger sister Morgan was always there for her, and sisterly affection was an important part of their childhood. The family was quite tight-knit, and although life in a small southern town didn't always offer many activities, Heather's parents were always supportive of her pursuit of independence and fulfillment. Her father, Terry, worked in the construction industry, and her mother, Debbie, was a homemaker. Together, they created a stable and supportive environment for their children. Heather was an ambitious young woman with a vibrant personality and a deep sense of self-worth. She graduated from high school in 2011, receiving her diploma from St. James School in Murrells Inlet. After high school, she made the decision to continue her education and attend college, but instead of going straight to another city, she decided to stay in her home county. Heather began her studies in cosmetology and enrolled in courses at a local college. She also gained experience at several restaurants, including Tilted Kilt and House of Blues, where she worked as a hostess. The work was enough to support herself, and despite her young age, Heather showed maturity and responsibility. As she transitioned into adulthood, her relationship with her family remained strong. Although Heather always strived for independence, she rented her first apartment in Carolina Forest, which she shared with her roommate, Brianna Worrelman, an out-of-state girl she had befriended in college. As if to prove her independence, Heather enjoyed the freedom her own apartment gave her. At times she missed the warmth of her family, but she tried to do the things she enjoyed: working, studying, and building social connections. It is quite possible that it was this independence and desire to experience new emotions that led her into complex personal relationships. One of the significant events in Heather's life was meeting Sidney Moorer, a 37-year-old repairman whom she met in June 2013 when he was repairing equipment at her workplace at the Tilted Kilt restaurant. Sidney was married, but that didn't stop their relationship from growing into an affair. From time to time, he would come to the restaurant to bring Heather coffee and bagels. Heather, by her own admission, felt attracted to the older man, which in turn made Sidney more attractive to her. According to her co-workers and friends, the relationship between Heather and Sidney grew rapidly, and she enthusiastically shared her emotions with them. Her Twitter feed was soon filled with explicit messages indicating her sexual attraction to Moorer. In particular, she wrote that she prefers older men, and also openly expressed sexual interest in a man who was doing repairs at her work. At one point, she even expressed a desire to date him, making no secret of her emotional involvement. This, in turn, did not go unnoticed by her friends and coworkers. However, in September 2013, the romance with Sidney came to an end. At this time, Tammy Moorer, Sidney's wife, found out about her husband's affair with Heather. Talks that her husband might be cheating had started even earlier, but at that point, Tammy was deeply shaken. She took action to end the relationship between Heather and her husband. Tammy personally called Heather and insisted that she stop communicating with her husband. During this conversation, Sidney humiliated Heather by telling her that she meant nothing to him, and, according to Bree's testimony, he ripped her apart mentally, making her feel unwanted and humiliated. After Heather and Sidney broke up, she tried to move on. However, in the back of her mind, she could not completely forget about the affair, especially since in conversation with her friends, she hinted at the possibility of rebuilding the relationship. What made things even more complicated was that Sidney's feelings were mutual. On December 17, 2013, Heather decided to give herself a chance and start a new page in her life. On this day, she went on a date with Stephen Schiraldi, a man she had met recently. The date was quite harmless. They drove around the streets admiring the Christmas lights and then stopped in the parking lot of Inlet Square Mall. Stephen showed Heather how to drive his manual transmission car. Heather took some pictures that she sent to her dad and Bree, talking about how she learned to drive the manual transmission car. Around 1:15 a.m. December 18, Stephen dropped Heather off at her apartment in Carolina Forest, and that was the last time she was seen alive. From that moment on, her life became a mystery to everyone. 20 minutes after she got home, Heather called her neighbor Bree, who was in another state at the time. They discussed the date and ended the conversation. That was Heather's last contact with her friend. Heather didn't get in touch for 2 days, and her friends and acquaintances began to worry. Bree, her roommate, felt anxious when she couldn't reach her friend after their last conversation. Heather had promised her that she wouldn't do anything rash, but her absence and silence was cause for concern. In addition, no one she knew where she might have been at the time, since she hadn't gone to work or returned home. At first, her friends tried to contact her through social media and cell phones, but without success. When things didn't improve, Bree and other acquaintances, after not hearing from her for a day, decided to contact the police. This was the moment when the investigation into Heather's disappearance officially began. On December 19, 2013, 2 days after Heather Elvis disappeared, her car, a green Dodge Intrepid, was found parked at Peachtree Landing in Secastia, South Carolina, about 13 kilometers from her apartment in Carolina Forest. The location was along the Waccamaw River, and already the very location of the car attracted the attention of law enforcement. The car was locked, and there was no Heather's cell phone, bag, or keys inside, showing clear signs that her disappearance was not accidental. These circumstances immediately led to the launch of an investigation, which became a major step in the search for the missing girl. The absence of Heather's personal belongings in the car was the first alarm signal for investigators. In a normal situation, a person would not leave their belongings in the car unless they intended to return. It also indicated that she may have been forcibly picked up or met someone who gained her trust and then took her away. Suspicions that Heather may have been the victim of a crime were confirmed when investigators found her car in a location where there were no obvious signs that she had stopped in the parking lot of her own free will. Once the car was found, investigators immediately began a search operation. Police officers and volunteers combed the surrounding area, including the banks of the Waccamaw River, where a body or any other evidence could have been hidden. Rescue divers dispatched to the search surveyed the river bottom in an attempt to find evidence, but neither Heather's body nor her personal belongings were found again. The river was thoroughly investigated, including its depths to Winyah Bay, but the search was inconclusive, only adding to the alarm and suspicion that Heather may have been abducted. The lack of footprints in and around the car also raised doubts among investigators that Heather had simply left of her own free will. Operatives began examining phone records and videos from locations that may have been linked to Heather's disappearance. The cell phone was one of the key objects to analyze, as evidence from it could give a clearer picture of the girl's last steps before her disappearance. Investigators soon gained access to Heather's cell phone data and began working with carriers to find out where her phone was at the time of her disappearance. Specifically, they found that her phone was active during the overnight hours beginning at 1:30 a.m. on D-Day 18, when Heather called her roommate Bree to report a conversation with Sydney. Heather's phone was followed by unusual routes that did not coincide with her normal activity. Cell phone station records showed that Heather's phone moved several times within a few miles of her apartment. The times the phone moved coincided with the times her car was found at Peachtree Landing. In addition, the data showed the phone was located near the marina, leading investigators to speculate that Heather may have been there, but she may no longer have used her cell phone for communication after that time. Phone analysis also revealed a connection to a payphone at 1:35 a.m. on Deck 18, which corresponded to the time Heather told Bree that Sydney had called her. That call, made from a payphone, was recorded near the scene of the accident, but despite investigators' best efforts, they couldn't pinpoint who was on the other end of the wire. This added fuel to the fire as questions about the role of Sydney Moorer, Heather's former lover, and his possible involvement in the girl's disappearance became increasingly urgent. Investigators also turned their attention to surveillance footage from various locations, including Walmart and nearby gas stations. Surveillance cameras at the gas station also showed that Sydney used a payphone from which a call was made to Heather's cell phone at 1:35 a.m. Key evidence included video footage from private residences along the route Sydney was to take with his vehicle. The cameras recorded his truck traveling at 3:36 and 3:39 a.m. toward Peachtree Landing and then back around 3:45 and 3:46 a.m. These recordings provided important confirmation that Sydney was in that neighborhood at the time of Heather's disappearance. The video also established that his car was in the area during the same time period when her phone was active. This allowed the investigation to establish a connection between Sydney and the scene, which heightened suspicions about his possible involvement in Heather's disappearance. Despite his denials, video footage, phone data, and other evidence continued to add up to a picture that pointed to his involvement in the events leading up to the girl's disappearance. The data collected gave grounds to continue the investigation in the direction of the abduction. The police did not rule out the possibility that Heather might have been forcibly taken away or hidden from view after her encounter with Sydney. Suspicion of Moorer became increasingly evident as his movements during the night hours and the facts of his presence in the area where Heather's car was found created irrefutable evidence of his connection to the disappearance. Additionally, based on the analysis of text messages and correspondence, police began to consider the possibility that Tammy Moorer, Sydney's wife, may have been involved in the incident. She was known to have repeatedly threatened Heather and attempted to interfere in her personal life, creating a potential motivation to get rid of a rival who was threatening her marriage. Thus, the investigation continued and investigators continued to gather evidence that could further confirm or deny their suspicions of Sydney and Tammy Moorer's guilt. When Sydney Moorer was interviewed early in the investigation, he claimed that he had nothing to do with Heather's disappearance and that he was at home with his wife on the night of her disappearance, without making contact with the girl. He adamantly denied that he had used a payphone to call Heather in the early morning hours of DC-18. However, when investigators presented him with surveillance video footage showing his truck driving past the scene and then his grocery shopping, his testimony changed. He admitted that he did communicate with Heather during those hours, but claimed it was only an optional conversation. Despite this, the evidence gathered by the investigation contradicted his words. Video camera evidence showed Sydney purchasing cigars and a pregnancy test at Walmart at 1:12 a.m. on December 18. This fact was an important indicator that he did have some intent toward Heather that evening. The pregnancy test he purchased suggested that he was concerned about the possibility that Heather might be pregnant by him, which added new and serious questions about how their relationship might have developed. His admissions about talking to Heather were unconvincing, especially when you consider that at that point he probably already knew that the girl had disappeared. Equally suspicious was the behavior of Sydney's wife, Tammy Moorer. After Heather's disappearance, her actions and words continued to alarm investigators. Tammy actively tried to exonerate her husband, denying his involvement in Heather's disappearance, while accusing the girl of stalking her family. She began spreading negative messages on social media, accusing Heather of allegedly being a threat to her children and family. These actions caused investigators to question the sincerity of her claims. The threats and accusations toward Heather only heightened suspicions that Tammy may have been more involved in what was going on than she claimed. Instead of raising concerns about Heather's disappearance, Tammy continued to assert that her family was not connected to her disappearance and that Heather was a danger to her children. She emphasized that Heather was trying to destroy her family, indicating that she had a strong emotional reaction and possibly jealousy. This caught the attention of investigators who began to look into Tammy's motives, including possible revenge for the perceived threat to her marriage. One of the most disturbing facts was Tammy's behavior in the period after Heather's disappearance. She actively used social media to portray Heather as a threat to her family, calling her a psychopath. At the same time, Tammy showed no signs of concern that Heather was missing. Instead, she continued to insist that Heather was to blame for what happened, giving the impression that she was trying to cover up her own role in the girl's disappearance. Investigators paid particular attention to text messages sent by Tammy to Heather prior to her disappearance. These messages contained explicit threats, indicating her negative attitude and willingness to act aggressively. This correspondence was an important clue that Tammy was likely involved in a conflict with Heather that could have escalated into something more serious. Another disturbing moment occurred when Tammy attempted to interfere with the working relationship between Sydney and Heather. She called the restaurant where Heather worked and threatened that if she did not quit her job, her husband would stop repairing equipment for the establishment. This interference also indicated her controlling position in her relationship with Sydney and may have been a motive to act against Heather. Once investigators began collecting additional cell phone data and analyzing video, it became apparent that Heather could not have simply disappeared of her own free will. Her phone remained active after her disappearance, and the data indicated its movement near locations related to Sydney and Tammy's actions. This gave the impression that Heather may have been abducted or forcibly held at a particular location. The uncertainty as to her subsequent whereabouts only confirmed this scenario, as the search for the body yielded no results. Based on all the evidence gathered, the investigation put forward the abduction theory. Video recordings that showed Sydney's presence in the same places where Heather's phone was located and their joint activity during that period became important links in establishing their connection to the girl's disappearance. In parallel, investigators were checking possible locations where Heather could have been held, which suggested their involvement in her abduction and attempts to cover their tracks. After carefully gathering evidence and testimony, investigators began filing formal charges against Sydney and Tammy Moore. On February 21, 2014, the couple was arrested on charges of murder, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. The charges were made possible by numerous pieces of evidence that included surveillance videos, phone records, and witness statements that linked them to Heather's disappearance. The criminal charges against Sydney and Tammy were based on the suspicion that they were involved in Heather's abduction and possible murder, in order to eliminate Heather's threat to their marriage. Parallel to the investigation into Heather's disappearance, a search of the Moorers' home uncovered financial crimes related to Medicaid fraud. Specifically, the Moorers were found to have attempted to hide the income generated from their businesses, which added an additional charge: Medicaid fraud. These charges were a new twist in the investigation, but the main focus remained on Heather's disappearance and the Moorers' involvement in her abduction. Investigators also began taking an in-depth look into the couple's personal lives, including their relationship and the motivation that might have driven them to such extreme measures. Heather's situation in some ways mirrored the crisis in Sydney and Tammy's marriage. Tammy was apparently so obsessed with jealousy and fear of losing control over her husband that she may have made the decision to eliminate Heather as a threat to her family. Tammy's behavior also manifested itself on social media, where she actively accused Heather of stalking her family and trying to destroy her marriage. Despite the arrests and accusations, Heather's body was never found. Several major search operations were conducted during the investigation, which included checking rivers, wetlands, and neighborhoods where her body may have been hidden. However, no physical traces were found in the Waccamaw River or surrounding areas that could help establish what happened to Heather. Rescue divers surveyed the river bottom, but the search was inconclusive. Additional operations involving search dogs and workers specializing in missing persons searches were additionally conducted, but all of these efforts were also unsuccessful. The only thing that was found was Heather's car left in the parking lot at Peachtree Landing. The absence of her body became one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation, as many questions remained as to what may have happened to her. Heather's body was not found during the search or during the investigation, which became another mystery in the case. It also meant that investigators could not directly confirm her murder, although suspicions of it were becoming increasingly clear amid the circumstances of the disappearance and the Moores' behavior. Following the arrest of Sydney and Tammy Moore, the investigation continued to actively gather additional evidence of their involvement in Heather's disappearance. Charges of murder, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice were formally filed on February 21, 2014. Further investigation also uncovered Medicaid fraud, which added a new charge to their list. However, the focus continued to be on Heather's case, with the prosecution insisting that the couple was responsible for her disappearance. All of the evidence gathered, including video footage, witness statements, and cell phone data analysis, was submitted to the court for further review. The allegations against the Moores became the basis for a trial that attracted public attention. The trials promised to be tense, given the conflicting testimony of the defendants and the absence of Heather's body, which left many questions unanswered. After Sidney and Tammy Moore were arrested and charged with kidnapping, murder, and obstruction of justice, the case went to trial for further proceedings. The Heather Elvis missing persons trial has become one of the most high-profile cases in South Carolina, garnering both local and national press attention. The charges against Sidney and Tammy were based on evidence collected by investigators that included security videos, cell phone data, and witness statements. This evidence suggested that the Moores were responsible for Heather's disappearance and possible murder, despite the absence of her body. The trial began with questioning and the presentation of evidence. The prosecution based its position on the fact that Heather's disappearance was the result of her conflict with Tammy Moore, who was probably jealous and afraid that her husband Sidney might have resumed a relationship with Heather. The opposing side argued that Sidney and Tammy were wrongly accused and that the evidence gathered by the investigation was insufficient to establish their guilt. The trial dragged on for months, and during the trial, key evidence was presented, such as surveillance footage, cell phone data, and witness statements that linked Sidney to the location where Heather's car was found. Also presented was Tammy's correspondence in which she threatened Heather, accusing her of destroying her family. Based on these facts, the prosecution alleged that the Moores were complicit in Heather's disappearance, as well as in an attempt to conceal her whereabouts. The main charge against Sidney Moore was the kidnapping and murder of Heather. During the trial, it was determined that Sidney was in close proximity to the scene the night of Heather's disappearance. Surveillance video footage of his truck, as well as witness statements, confirmed that he was in the area of Peachtree Landing, where Heather's car was left. In addition, the investigation presented evidence that Sidney had used a payphone to call Heather, although he initially denied this fact. At trial, he pleaded guilty to having contact with Heather on the night of her disappearance, but insisted that he was not involved in her kidnapping or murder. For Tammy Moore, Sidney's wife, the charge was based on her aggressive behavior toward Heather. Tammy had threatened the girl on several occasions, sending her text messages in which she called her a psycho. The investigation also presented evidence of her interference in Sidney's working relationship with Heather, as well as her threats to fire Heather from the restaurant if she did not stop communicating with her husband. Tammy's testimony at trial contradicted the evidence adduced. She insisted that she had nothing to do with Heather's disappearance, claiming that her interference in the relationship between her husband and the girl was merely an attempt to save her marriage. Nevertheless, her aggressive behavior and the text messages she sent to Heather caused the judge to doubt her sincerity and was motivated by possible revenge for threatening her family. Charges were dropped on several counts during the trial. In 2016, charges of murder and several other offenses were dropped because there was not enough compelling evidence to support the charge. However, the kidnapping and obstruction of justice charges remained in effect. For Tammy Moore, the murder charges were also dropped, but her involvement in the kidnapping conspiracy was proven in further proceedings. In addition, charges were dismissed in 2016 for portions of the financial misconduct and Medicaid fraud offenses, as those cases were not directly related to Heather's disappearance, though they did increase suspicion against the Moores. In September 2019, the court found Sidney Moore guilty of kidnapping Heather Elvis and obstruction of justice. Based on the evidence collected, such as video footage, witness statements, and cell phone data, the court concluded that Sidney was involved in Heather's disappearance. His admission that he communicated with Heather the night of her disappearance, but did not report her whereabouts, supported his involvement. Sidney Moore was sentenced to 30 years in prison for kidnapping and obstruction of justice. The court took into account that he had a long history of lying to investigators and trying to cover up his involvement in the case, which was used as an aggravating factor. On October 23, 2018, Tammy Moore was found guilty of conspiracy to kidnap Heather Villas. Despite her claims that she had nothing to do with the girl's disappearance, her text messages and attempts to interfere in Heather's personal affairs, as well as her aggressive reaction to their relationship with Sidney, allowed the court to conclude that she was involved. Tammy Moorer was sentenced to 30 years in prison for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The court took into account her behavior after Heather's disappearance, as well as her interference in Sydney and Heather's working relationship, which further confirmed her motives. Amanda Williams was born in the mid-1980s in Cleveland, Ohio. Since childhood, she was characterized by a bright personality and desire for success. She was the youngest of 3 children in the family, and her parents always tried to surround her with attention and support. Amanda grew up in an atmosphere of love and care, which had a significant impact on her character. Her father was a professional engineer and her mother an educator, which gave her an early understanding of the importance of education and work ethic. Amanda showed good aptitude in her studies and was active in school life. She was a member of the school theater and did volunteer work helping those in need and organizing various events. It was during these years that she realized how important it is to have clear goals and work to achieve them. After graduating from high school, she enrolled at Cleveland State University, choosing a major in business and management. This choice was not accidental. Amanda always dreamed of having her own business and aspired to work in a field that would allow her to realize her potential. After receiving her degree, Amanda decided to turn her ambitions into reality and opened her own beauty salon. She was not only a talented stylist but also a successful businesswoman. In a few years, she managed to make her salon one of the popular places in the city, gathering a lot of regular clients, including celebrities. She was characterized by determination and worked late into the night to ensure that her business flourished. Many noted that her success in business was not accidental. Amanda knew how to deal with people, always remained attentive and friendly. However, despite a successful career, Amanda's personal life was not so cloudless. Amanda was married twice. Her first husband was a man she met while still at university. They got married soon after graduation, but this marriage did not last long. The reasons for the divorce were personal and concerned differences in views on life and the future. After the divorce, Amanda took on the responsibility of raising 2 children whom she loved with all her heart and on whom she placed the main emphasis in her life. She devoted a lot of time to her family despite working intensely in a beauty salon. Amanda would dive headfirst into work to provide her children with a better life, but always remained a caring mother. A few years after her divorce, Amanda met Tyrrell Edwards. Edwards was a man with a certain charm, and at first glance seemed like the perfect partner for Amanda. He was a few years older than her, worked in construction, and was involved in various business projects. According to Amanda's friends, Tyrrell was charismatic and caring, and he and Amanda seemed like the perfect couple. He complimented her, expressed admiration for her successes, and offered to help her grow her business. They began dating, and soon Edwards asked Amanda to marry him. They announced their engagement at one of their family dinners, where Edwards ceremoniously pulled out a ring and asked Joe Lewis, Amanda's father, for permission to marry. The family was happy for her, as Tyrrell seemed like a man who would be able to support and take care of her and her children. They began to prepare for the wedding, and despite a previous failed relationship, Amanda was confident that she would find happiness with Tyrrell. But as with many relationships, not everything was as smooth as it seemed at first glance. Although they lived together, the tension in their relationship grew with each passing month. Tyrrell wasn't as perfect as he seemed in the beginning. As the wedding drew closer, it became clear that he had a tendency to be controlling and often lodged complaints with Amanda, especially about her job and the time she spent on the business. He accused her of focusing too much on her career and not enough on her family. Amanda, for her part, tried to keep the relationship together for the sake of the family, but over time it became clear that their outlook on life was very different. Eventually, she made the difficult decision to part ways with Tyrrell. They divorced, but the relationship did not end. After the divorce, arguments and tension continued, especially when Tyrrell would get jealous or start taking things he left in the house. Amanda had trouble cutting ties with him completely, leading to regular bickering, despite the legal end of their marriage. October 9, 2023 started out as a normal day for Amanda. She got up early as she always did and began preparing for a new day of work. She spent a lot of time in the salon helping clients and organizing the staff. Everything was going according to plan and nothing seemed to portend trouble. Later that evening, after she had finished her work, Amanda ran into Tyrrell. An argument broke out between the two of them once again. The verbal altercation quickly escalated into a conflict they couldn't control. After the quarrel, there was a brief lull when things seemed to calm down a bit. But it was at this point that something terrible happened. A single gunshot, and Amanda Williams' life was cut short. Police were called to the scene, but it was too late. On October 9, 2023, when police arrived on the scene, night had already fallen on Warrensville Heights, and the house on Sunset Street was shrouded in silence. It was an ordinary place in the neighborhood, without much sign of anything out of the ordinary. A house with a one-story structure, a well-kept lot with a small lawn. However, it was here that a tragedy occurred that shocked not only the family and friends of the deceased, but the entire neighborhood. Police were called to the scene the night before it was all over. The police officers standing outside the house noticed there were no people on the street, only a few cars parked along the road. They walked around the property first, making sure there were no obvious threats before heading to the front door. The entrance to the house was closed but not locked. On examining the door, they found that the lock was not damaged and the house was free to enter. The front door was opened and the officers entered the dark living room where they sensed an unsettling atmosphere from the first steps. The house was empty except for the incident itself, which had become the center of attention. In the kitchen next to the dining table, the body of Amanda Williams was discovered. She was lying on the floor, her body already lifeless. The officers immediately noticed the bloody footprints that led from her and spilled across the floor. The body was in the position in which it had fallen after the shooting. Amanda Williams was found in a state that at first glance would appear that she was in the process of defending herself or even a desperate struggle. However, it soon became clear that her death was almost instantaneous. The woman was dressed in normal household clothes, confirming that she had not anticipated the turn of events. Her body showed signs of close contact with a weapon, as well as traces of blood, which spoke of a quick and tragic outcome to the conflict. Signs of violence were evident. Abrasions and small cuts on her arms, confirming her attempts to defend herself. Traces of blood were visible around the body, stretching to the door and to the kitchen table. The blood was not only on the floor but also on the furniture surfaces, indicating sudden and quick movements before the moment of murder. These footprints were given attention because they could indicate the direction of movement of the assailant or indicate attempts at resistance. The first object of the officer's attention was the gun that was near Williams' body. It was placed in close proximity to her hands, as if she had attempted to either defend herself with it or had attempted to use the weapon at some point in an attempt to stop the threat. However, the gun was not pointed at the attacker, but was simply lying nearby. This immediately raised questions for the investigators. Why was the gun not used in a moment of self-defense? The gun was seized and submitted for examination to determine if it was used at the time of the murder and how it could be linked to the first and only suspect, Tyrrell Edwards. It itself was in the house in a lost condition and showed signs of a struggle. The forensic examination was to answer questions about possible fingerprints and identify other evidence that could be important to the investigation. After police located the body and recovered the gun, investigators turned their attention to a car parked outside the home that belonged to Edwards. 2 other guns were found in the car, which immediately drew attention. This fact could have been a clue as to the motive for the crime. Investigators did not know exactly who the guns belonged to, as there was no clear evidence that Edwards had used them during the crime. More tests and forensics had to be conducted to determine if the guns belonged to Edwards and what they might have meant in the context of what happened. Forensics also had to check for fingerprints on these guns, as well as to see if they had been used in other crimes or stored under conditions that could indicate malicious intent. These guns became a key element of the investigation because they could corroborate or refute Edwards' statements about his actions at the time of the crime. In addition to the guns, other objects were found at the crime scene that also played a role in the investigation. A large kitchen knife and an igniter were found next to Amanda's body, which was obviously used at the time of the conflict. The knife was found with blood on it, indicating that it may have been used by Williams to defend herself. However, the mere fact that the knife was found near her body raised questions. An incendiary was also found close to the knife, which could indicate that it was used during the conflict. It may have been an accident, but it was also part of the evidence that was to be sent for examination to learn more about how and why it all happened. All of it, the weapon, the knife, and the incendiary, was carefully seized and sent for examination. The experts had to determine if these items were used at the time of the crime and how they could corroborate or refute the suspect's testimony. Investigators also began work on interviewing witnesses as well as reviewing any possible evidence that could lead to additional conclusions as to how and why the murder occurred. An important point was that no other signs of violence were found at the crime scene, other than those involving Williams herself. After the initial steps of the investigation were completed, the investigation focused on finding out how Edwards could have been connected to the tools and how they could have been used at the time of the tragedy. After the tragic accident, when police arrived on the scene and began their examination, Tyrrell Edwards was apprehended and taken to the local police station for questioning that same evening. According to his statement, he was at the scene and was prepared to give his version of what happened between him and Amanda Williams that fateful evening. Edwards claimed that the altercation stemmed from Williams' failure to respond to a text message he sent in the morning, and that she eventually began threatening him with a knife and an incendiary, demanding that he leave her home. These events, he said, were what led to the tragic outcome. Edwards claimed that when he saw the threat from Williams, he began filming what was happening on his cell phone to capture what was happening. He reported that he initially took his 2 guns from the house to avoid using them against Williams and put them in his car. However, he soon returned to the house where he retrieved Williams' gun and proceeded to shoot the video. According to his account, when Williams continued to threaten him with a knife and an igniter, he felt he was in mortal danger, which he said was the reason he shot her. He claimed he was trying to protect his life. He also claimed that he did not expect the situation to get out of control and the shot was fired as a last resort to protect himself. One of the most significant items that Edwards presented to police as evidence of his version of events was his cell phone video. The footage captured the moment the shot was fired, although the incident itself was not fully visible, as the camera was not focused on the shooting itself, but rather on the events before it. Nevertheless, the sound of the gunshot was clearly audible on the video. This was the first important piece of evidence that the police could use to analyze what happened. The video also showed that Edwards made no attempt to de-escalate the situation, even though he had a gun. His actions on the tape raised questions as to why he did not take steps to try to resolve the conflict without violence. This video became a critical element to the investigation because it called into question Edwards' testimony of self-defense. Instead of attempting to defuse the situation or end the altercation, he continued to record what was happening and made no attempt to stop the conflict from escalating. The next day, October 10, 2023, Edwards was again questioned. During the new interrogation, his testimony began to diverge. First, he stated that he had removed his guns from the house because he did not want to use them against Williams. This statement already seemed odd considering that he had used Amanda's gun at the time of the conflict. Edwards also changed his testimony that day and said that Williams held him hostage and that he was terrified that she might use his guns against him. This point was extremely important because it completely changed the picture of what had happened. His account of being held hostage in his own situation and that she could have used his weapon against him did not match the reality that was manifesting itself through the evidence and video footage that had been collected. Investigators began working with physical evidence found at the crime scene. They seized several objects that later became key to proving Edwards' guilt and confirming that his version of events was implausible. The first items seized were 2 handguns found in Edwards' vehicle parked near the house. At the time, it was unknown to whom the guns belonged. After a thorough check, it was determined that both guns belonged to Edwards. This discovery played an important role in the investigation. The guns he had previously removed from the house were his property, and the fact that they were in his automobile did not support his version that he was trying to avoid using the guns against Williams. Rather, it appeared to be an attempt to remove the instruments of violence which belonged to Edwards from the house in order to create the appearance of his innocence. Williams's gun and Edwards's prints. The Williams pistol, which was in the house, confirmed the speculation. Edwards' fingerprints were found on this weapon. A knife and an incendiary. In addition, a knife and an incendiary were found in the room next to Williams' body. The knife was clearly used by Williams to threaten Edwards during the conflict, and its presence was evidence that she had attempted to defend herself or threaten him. Williams' fingerprints were also found on the knife and the incendiary, which likely indicated that these items were in her hands at the time of the incident. On October 11, 2023, police continued their investigation, focusing on a more in-depth analysis of all the evidence. Discrepancies in his testimony, fingerprints found on the weapon and other items, and facts revealed in interviews indicated that Edwards was responsible for the murder, and his claims of self-defense and hostage-taking did not match reality. At this point, it became apparent that the investigation was taking a serious turn, and investigators began to doubt Edwards' version of events based on the evidence gathered and his changing testimony. On October 12, 2023, Tyrell Edwards was arrested after the investigation and evidence collected cast doubt on his testimony and confirmed suspicions of his involvement in the murder of Amanda Williams. The arrest was a key moment in an investigation that was developing rapidly, especially after video and physical evidence uncovered revealed contradictions in his statements. He was detained at his home and immediately sent to the local police department for further questioning and investigation. Edwards' arrest was carefully planned. The police knew that his detention had to be conducted quietly to avoid any possible attempts by him to flee or resist. Edwards was at his home in a Cleveland neighborhood, and law enforcement officers, relying on a warrant that had been issued based on evidence gathered, arrived at his home at approximately 9:00 a.m. The officers arrived at his residence at the time of the arrest. Their action was swift and decisive. The arrest operation caused no significant problems. Edwards did not attempt to flee, nor did he offer any resistance. He probably already realized that the investigation of him had taken a serious turn. According to the police, the arrest was conducted without incident. Edwards opened the door himself, and police officers entered the house with an arrest warrant charging him. This meant that the investigators already had probable cause to detain him, and Edwards may have realized that he could not escape responsibility for what had happened. His detention was standard procedure, and his demeanor during the arrest was calm, albeit emotionally strained. Edwards did not attempt to flee, did not challenge the arrest, and simply complied. He may have been shocked that his actions had become so obvious and that law enforcement was gathering sufficient evidence to file murder charges. Police officers immediately conducted a controlled search of his home to make sure there would be no threat to their safety, and then took him to the police station for further action. He was placed in a holding cell where he was formally charged with the murder of Amanda Williams, as well as domestic violence. As witnesses noted, at the time of his arrest, Tyrell Edwards was visibly tense but maintained restraint. His demeanor remained sufficiently cool-headed that it appeared as if he was already aware that his versions of self-defense and the imminent threat he was experiencing did not stand up to scrutiny. Investigators observed that his attempts to explain his actions at the time of his arrest were not convincing, and Edwards showed no apparent willingness to cooperate or exonerate himself. Following his arrest, Edwards was taken to the police department where he was offered the right to counsel. At this point, he was again subjected to questioning, and his testimony was again carefully analyzed. The police already had enough information to realize that his testimony did not match the facts. The video he provided only confirmed his actions, but in no way confirmed that his life was in any real danger, as he claimed. The investigators proceeded to further parse his testimony. They scrutinized his every move, from the moment he began filming what was happening on his cell phone to how he continued filming after taking Williams' gun. His explanation that he was acting in self-defense was quickly challenged based on analysis of the video and other evidence. Failure to understand why he didn't try to use his own guns to defend himself if the threat was really that serious also cast doubt on his version. At this point, investigators began to analyze physical evidence more deeply, such as fingerprints on Williams' gun and the guns found in his car. This evidence became central to the decision to charge him. After his arrest, Edwards was transferred to jail, where he awaited further trial. His detention meant that the police had already accumulated enough evidence to charge him with murder, and all further steps were aimed at preparing him for trial. Edwards' arrest was a major milestone in the investigation. It was one of the key moments that allowed law enforcement to gather all the facts and evidence necessary to prove his guilt. From the moment of his arrest all the way through the trial, the investigation continued to delve into the details of the incident, but all evidence pointed to his direct involvement in the tragedy that occurred at Amanda Williams' home. At this point, the investigation moved on to preparing all the materials for submission to the court. Edwards remained in custody, and his case was now part of the trial that would determine his fate. Thus, Edwards' arrest on October 12, 2023, was a decisive step in the case. Tyrell Edwards' trial began in early 2024, and the trials were an important milestone for everyone involved, from the prosecutors and defense to the family of Amanda Williams, who were hungry for justice. The case attracted a lot of public attention, especially after it was revealed that Edwards was not only involved in the death of his ex-fiancée, but also tried to manipulate the circumstances by making it appear that he acted in self-defense. The trial lasted several days, and throughout the sessions, the prosecution presented compelling evidence against Edwards. Among the key pieces of evidence were cell phone videos that captured his behavior before the murder, as well as expert testimony that analyzed fingerprints and other evidence found at the crime scene. Edwards' defense attempted to portray his actions as forced self-defense, but the evidence presented left no doubt that the murder was committed with excessive violence, not justified by the circumstance. The trial began on March 4, 2024 in Cuyahoga County Court, where Edwards was indicted on 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of grievous bodily harm, and 1 count of domestic violence. During the trial, evidence was presented to show that not only did Edwards not try to prevent the violence, but instead he continued to film what was happening on his phone despite having a gun in his hands and threats from William. The key moment was a video taken by Edwards at the time of the murder. The recording showed the sound of a gunshot, but its content did not support Edwards' claim that he acted in self-defense. Rather, the video showed him passive and making no attempt to end the conflict. Investigators determined that the gun Williams used at the time of the murder belonged to her, and his fingerprints were found on it. This was strong evidence of his direct involvement in the crime, which also contradicted his claim that he did not use her gun. The defense's task was to prove that Edwards was in danger when he killed Williams. The defense argued that the woman was violent and that Edwards acted in defense of her life. However, none of the evidence presented supported this theory. To the contrary, witness testimony, including video and fingerprint studies, indicated that Edwards was not trying to avoid violence, but instead was escalating it. The prosecution also cited evidence of prior altercations between Edwards and Williams, which led to the inference of a strained relationship between the couple. These quarrels, prosecutors argued, may have been the cause of the murder. Specifically, investigators argued that Edwards could not justify his actions, even considering the conflict, as he had the opportunity to leave the house and avoid violence. In addition, the prosecution emphasized that the video did not show Edwards attempting to calm Williams down or resolve the situation peacefully. Instead, he continued to film what was happening on his cell phone, which prosecutors said indicated his intent to manipulate the situation and create the illusion of self-defense. On March 11, 2024, after weeks of trial, the jury reached its verdict. Edwards was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of grievous bodily harm, and a charge of domestic violence. However, the charge of murder with premeditation was rejected by the jury. They found that Edwards' actions were not premeditated, but the evidence indicated that he acted with excessive violence, which could have affected the court's ultimate decision. On March 11, 2024, the Cuyahoga Court formally sentenced Tyrell Edwards to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after only 24 years. While the court took into account mitigating factors such as no prior convictions, Edwards' employment, and his involvement in raising his children, these factors were not sufficient to mitigate his guilt for the crime. Lindsay May Lee was born on October 3, 1987, in a small town in South Carolina. She was the third child in a family that has always valued hard work and determination. Since childhood, Lindsay showed outstanding abilities in studies and sports. Her favorite classes were math and computer science, as well as physical activity, which later developed into a serious interest in fitness. Lindsay grew up with a clear sense that she wanted to do something meaningful and help others. After successfully completing high school in 2005, Lindsay enrolled at the University of South Carolina, where she chose to major in information technology. Here, her diligence and ability to solve complex problems did not go unnoticed. Lindsay became popular among her teachers and peers, and her academic success allowed her to quickly build a career. Shortly after graduation, she landed a job with the Lexington County Sheriff's Department. Employees of the department spoke of her as a top-notch professional whose integrity and professionalism always came first. Lindsay was one of those people who not only did her job but genuinely cared about what was going on around her. She helped her colleagues, organized events, and was always ready to support someone in a difficult moment. But her life outside of work wasn't always as serene. Although her professional life was on top of her game, her personal life was going through some tough times. In 2012, Lindsay met Jason Lee. Jason, a little older than her, worked in the security industry and repaired locks, which allowed him to connect with Lindsay. Initially, Jason seemed like an interesting and charming man to Lindsay, and they began dating. He seemed caring and attentive, and Lindsay soon became convinced that she had found a man with whom she could build a future. 2 years into their relationship, in 2014, they got married. That year, Lindsay was full of hope and confidence that their life together would be long and happy. However, over time, the relationship began to deteriorate. Jason became increasingly aggressive and discontent, especially when Lindsay began to focus more and more on her career and health. She began to lose weight, becoming more confident, which only irritated Jason. Every day their relationship became more and more strained, and in 2016 Lindsay began to think about divorce. At that point their marriage had long been unhappy, and Jason's constant quarrels and threats were becoming more and more frequent. In early 2017, Lindsay officially filed for divorce. The process was complicated and emotionally intense, and Jason couldn't seem to accept that their relationship had come to an end. Lindsay began dating other people and actively exercised, losing over 130 pounds and regaining her confidence. She was determined to start a new life away from her toxic relationship with Jason. On March 14, 2017, Lindsay failed to show up for work at the Lexington County Sheriff's Department, causing concern among her co-workers. Lindsay was a responsible employee, and her absence that day was unexpected. Knowing Lindsay's complicated relationship with her husband and that the divorce was already being finalized, co-workers and friends began trying to reach her. However, despite their best efforts, Lindsay did not return calls and messages. As time passes, concern grows, and one of her co-workers, aware of the dire family situation, decides to check out what has happened. He arrives at her home in West Columbia to conduct a welfare check. This decision turns out to be fatal. While inspecting the house, he discovered Lindsay's body in the bathtub. She was lying in the water, and her death was obvious. When the police arrived on the scene, the situation already seemed unusual and suspicious. Lindsay Lee's home was located in a quiet West Columbia neighborhood that was not known for a high crime rate. However, upon discovering Lindsay's body, it became clear that the incident was of a much darker nature than originally thought. The police immediately began examining the crime scene, trying to gather any possible evidence that might shed light on what had happened. Upon arriving at the scene, police officers noticed that the back door of the house had been broken into. This immediately attracted attention because entry through the front door was entirely possible, and if it was a casual visit, it could have been through the main entrance. However, the marks on the back door indicated that someone had clearly tried to enter the house illegally. The locks were damaged, and the doors themselves looked like someone had tried to pry them open with tools. This immediately suggested a possible burglary. However, the footprints only became stranger and more contradictory from there. The hallway was a mess. On the floor were scattered things, shoes, small items that could not have been randomly scattered in the course of ordinary life. This clutter was uncharacteristic of Lindsay's home, which was always kept in order. It seemed to indicate that someone had broken into the house not just to steal something, but for some other purpose. This fact led investigators to think that the motive for the crime was more personal than just theft. As police officers progressed through the house, they reached the bathroom where Lindsay's body was found. She was lying in the tub in a position as if she had been left there after death had been caused by brutal violence. Traces of blood were visible on the bathroom floor, and they shed light on the extent of the violence the victim had faced. Closer to the walls, a large number of marks were visible, indicating that Lindsay may have tried to run away or fight back. She had not simply died from impact or shock, but appeared to have been beaten and otherwise brutalized before being left in the bathtub to die. This fact increased investigators' suspicions that the murder was not random and was linked to deeply personal motives. An equally important find was Lindsay's jacket, discovered in the washing machine. It attracted attention because its presence there seemed unusual. The jacket was damp, which could indicate that someone had tried to wash it, perhaps hoping that the marks left on the jacket would not be discovered. Several footprints were also found inside the car, but they could not yet be identified at the time of the examination. The jacket and its condition led to the idea that the perpetrator was attempting to cover his tracks, perhaps hoping that it would not be possible to determine what had happened. In addition, blue latex gloves were found in the bathroom. This discovery immediately raised questions. Why did the perpetrator use the gloves? It was obvious that it was to avoid leaving fingerprints. This discovery also suggested that the crime was planned and that the killer was trying to conceal his involvement in the incident. The gloves became an important element of the investigation. A whole pattern of violence was evident at the crime scene, in addition to traces of blood. Medical examiners who arrived on the scene noted that the victim had been severely beaten. Visible injuries included numerous bruises on the neck and body, as well as signs of strangulation. Signs of bleeding on the body and wounds associated with mutilation in the throat area, most likely inflicted with a knife, indicated that death was not instantaneous and was the result of prolonged abuse. In addition, there were bloodstains on the bathroom walls and on the floor, which also indicated that the victim had attempted to struggle and defend himself. These bloodstains led to the conclusion that Lindsay had probably fought back against her attacker, which in turn supported the hypothesis of a personal vendetta or family relationship rather than a random crime. An equally important find was a car parked outside Lindsay's home. As police officers surveyed the street, they noticed a car that was parked near her home. It was soon determined that this car belonged to Lindsay Lee, the deceased. This became another place to look for clues or possible items that would open light on the cause of Lindsay's murder. Forensic experts immediately began examining the fingerprints found at the scene. Initial examination revealed that there were no prints on various items in the house, including doorknobs, furniture, and other surfaces that could belong to the victim. At the same time, DNA traces were found on blue gloves and other items that could later lead to the intruder. Based on these initial findings, police began to build several leads. One of them was related to the robbery. The signs of forced entry and the clutter in the house could indicate that the perpetrator had come to steal something. However, the absence of missing items, as well as the careful preparation of the crime, reflected in the use of gloves and attempts to hide traces, cast doubt on this version. The second version, which investigators began to develop, concerned personal motives. Perhaps Jason, whether against the backdrop of divorce, a difficult relationship, and the threat of losing control of Lindsay's life, could have been the impetus for the violence. Police began to suspect that the murder was not random but a planned act of revenge. Signs of violence and a desire to cover up evidence, including gloves and a jacket in the washing machine, only confirmed this theory. After investigators completed their examination of the crime scene and collected the first important pieces of evidence, the investigation focused on one key element: the illegal substances found in Lindsay's car. A small package was discovered in the car, hidden in the glove compartment. This discovery raised certain questions for investigators, as all of Lindsay's acquaintances as well as her colleagues in the Lexington County Sheriff's Department categorically stated that she had never used illegal substances. Lindsay was a strict and organized woman who always took care of her health and appearance, and her friends and colleagues could not believe such information. Nevertheless, the police could not simply ignore this fact. How the illegal substances could have gotten into Lindsay's car remained an open question, and it could have been an important link in the chain of investigation. The investigation decided to scrutinize the find, and DNA samples were taken from the package. When the results came back, they showed that there were traces of DNA on the package that matched those on the blue latex gloves found at the crime scene. This discovery was a major milestone in the investigation, although no one could yet say for sure exactly who the DNA belonged to. The focus of the investigation was now on Jason Lee, Lindsay's ex-husband, who became the prime suspect. The police began collecting information about him, studying his movements, as well as analyzing his behavior on the day of the murder. Jason wasn't the only person who could be connected to the crime, but his skills, as well as several suspicious coincidences, made investigators pay close attention to him. One of the most suspicious facts involved his professional skills. Jason Lee worked in the security industry and was skilled at installing and opening locks, which was an important piece of evidence. On the day of the murder, according to the investigation, Jason could have used his skills to get into Lindsay's house through the back door, having first broken the lock. This theory became increasingly likely, given that the locks on the back door were indeed damaged, indicating the possible use of tools. The investigation quickly determined that Jason knew how to pick locks, and this became an important piece of evidence. After experts determined that the door had been broken into, police began to build a theory about how the crime itself took place. They hypothesized that Jason arrived at Lindsay's home on the evening of March 13, 2017. He likely expected her to be home at a certain time and used his professional expertise to easily open the back door so as not to leave a mark on the front entrance. Investigators also determined that Lindsay was holding a grocery bag at the time of the murder, indicating that she had just returned home. When she entered the house, Jason attacked her. He beat her, took hold of her throat with his hands, squeezing her throat, and used a knife to mutilate the victim's throat before leaving her body in the bathtub to die from blood loss. The investigation also highlighted the oddities surrounding Jason's fitness bracelet. He used the device to track his activity and health, and its data became an important element of the investigation. According to data collected from his Fitbit, there was a strange pause in his activity on the night of March 13, 14. The data showed that there was no activity recorded on his fitness bracelet for several hours when investigators believe a murder may have been committed. This was highly unusual, as such long pauses never occurred on other days. Based on this data, investigators began to suspect that Jason may have spent this time not at his home, but at Lindsay's home, where he committed the crime. Police thoroughly investigated Jason's movements that evening. It was determined that he traveled to West Columbia, where Lindsay's home was located, in his personal automobile. Later, according to witnesses and surveillance footage, he was spotted at a Walmart in the neighboring town of Simpsonville, where he likely stopped after the murder. He parked his car and walked across several parking lots for a short time, which investigators believe may have been an attempt to distance himself from the vehicle he drove to West Columbia. A few minutes later, Jason returned to the same vehicle to park it next to other vehicles, and then continued his actions by making several purchases at Walmart. One of the key points for the investigation was Jason's behavior after the murder. He reported that he woke up at his Simpsonville home and discovered that his vehicle was gone. However, analysis of data from his Fitbit and testimony from other witnesses contradicted what he said. The data showed that he was not at his home that day, but in the neighborhood where the murder occurred. This contradiction caused investigators to focus even more on Jason as the prime suspect. In addition, police needed to take DNA samples from Jason for further comparisons. However, investigators realized that if they started acting too quickly and aggressively, it could make him suspicious, and he might try to escape or destroy evidence. At the time, the police did not have enough direct evidence to make an arrest, and the investigation decided to proceed cautiously to avoid spooking the suspect. This was a risky decision, as each day without new evidence left them with a sense of uncertainty. The investigation continued to gather more evidence to strengthen their case and bring it to a finale. The evidence that pointed to Jason was getting stronger and stronger, but there was still a lot of work to be done before they could prove his guilt. His movements, oddities in his statements, and evidence from the crime scene hinted at his involvement, but they weren't enough to make an arrest. All of this information helped build a theory that Jason Lee may have been involved in the murder of his wife, but in order to complete the investigation and bring him out into the open, the police needed to gather more evidence and obtain DNA samples for final certainty. After the police gathered enough evidence to solidify their suspicions, the decisive moment came. Jason Lee, Lindsay's ex-husband, was brought in for questioning to clarify his involvement in the crime under investigation. His behavior and testimony became an important link in a case that, despite the plethora of evidence, was not yet closed. The police knew they had to approach the case carefully to avoid giving Jason a chance to escape or destroy evidence. But they also realized that this was a chance to get a confession, or at the very least, to create additional grounds for arrest. The moment Jason was called in for questioning, his appearance immediately caught the investigators' attention. There were noticeable scratches on his face that looked like injuries sustained from fingernails. This was an important element for police because experts had previously found traces of tissue, blood, and possibly skin particles from another person under Lindsay's fingernails. This evidence was key, indicating that Lindsay was trying to defend herself against her attacker, and that she may have left marks on his body as she struggled. When investigators asked Jason about the cause of these scratches, he immediately tried to explain them as the effects of an accidental shave. This statement immediately alerted the police. Jason claimed that the scratches on his face were the result of sloppy shaving, but investigators already had information that he had been telling co-workers for several days that he had received the injuries from his cat. This contradiction in his testimony seemed odd, and it became obvious to the police that Jason was hiding the real cause of the injuries. Why had the cat left such scratches on Jason's face? It was unlikely. Too many coincidences and oddities in his stories suggested that he was trying to hide the real cause of these injuries. For investigators, this was an important indicator that Jason might have been involved in his wife's murder. At the same time, experts had already noted that there were signs of a struggle at the crime scene and that Lindsay was likely trying to defend herself by inflicting injuries on her killer. What was particularly disturbing was that Jason began his narrative of what had happened before he was even questioned about the case. When he was invited for questioning, he immediately began to talk about where he had been at the time of the murder, and it all sounded like a prearranged version that he had built up without knowing what questions he would be asked. This seemed unusual and suspicious, as the normal behavior of a murder suspect is to answer questions, not to start a narrative on his own initiative. Jason claimed that he was far away from the scene at the time of Lindsay's murder, and his alibi was supposedly ironclad. However, the investigation already knew that his testimony did not match the facts. Surveillance cameras recorded his presence in the West Columbia area, including in the parking lot where he parked his car and later returned to Walmart in his work vehicle. All of this data showed that Jason could not have been where he claimed to be at the time. In addition, the police already knew that his version of what happened did not match other data. Information about his fitness bracelet showed a strange pause in his activity, which also didn't match his account of allegedly being away from Lindsay's house. This fact further undermined the credibility of his claims. The police were convinced that Jason was lying in every story he told in an attempt to cover up his involvement in the crime. When the police realized that Jason continued to lie despite the many facts pointing to his involvement, the decision was made to arrest him. Investigators knew they couldn't let Jason get away while they had enough evidence to charge him with murder. They didn't want to let the moment pass, and a detention became inevitable. In addition, the police decided that now would be a good time to take DNA samples from Jason to make further comparisons with the samples found at the crime scene. These samples included traces found on the blue latex gloves and in Lindsay's car. Jason's DNA samples became key to the investigation at that point, as they could definitively confirm or deny his involvement in the murder. Jason was arrested and taken to the station where he was charged with murder and other burglary and robbery offenses. During interrogation, already as a suspect, he continued to insist on his innocence, claiming that he did not kill Lindsay. But his answers became increasingly confused and contradictory. After his arrest, Jason was analyzed and his DNA samples were sent to a lab to be compared to samples obtained from the crime scene. These samples were taken from the gloves from which his DNA was extracted, as well as from a bag of illegal substances found in Lindsay's car. The experts quickly compared the data, and the results left no doubt. The DNA on the gloves and the bag of illegal substances was a perfect match to Jason Lee's DNA. This match was decisive for the police. They now possessed irrefutable evidence that Jason was not only at the scene of the crime, but also involved in the murder of his wife. All his attempts to justify himself became empty words, and the investigation had enough grounds to continue the investigation and prepare for the trial. After Jason Lee was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife Lindsay, the case went to trial, which attracted the attention of both the local community and the media. The trial began in June 2019, and for many, it was a long-awaited moment to learn what happened on that fateful day, March 13, 2017, when Lindsay was murdered in her own home. The trial scrutinized every aspect of the crime, from the evidence collected at the scene to the testimony of the parties. The trial began with the opening of the indictment, which charged Jason Lee with the premeditated murder of his wife, as well as first-degree burglary and other offenses. The prosecution presented evidence that Jason broke into Lindsay's home using his professional skills as a locksmith and killed her with extreme cruelty. The motivation was established during the trial: divorce and financial problems, and the threat of losing control of Lindsay's life as she planned to start a new life. Jason's attorneys tried to portray him in a softer light, arguing that his actions were caused by emotional breakdown and stress related to the divorce, and that the murder was not premeditated. However, the evidence presented, including DNA found on gloves and a bag of banned substances in Lindsay's car, refuted this theory. One of the key points of the trial was the comparison of the DNA with samples obtained from the crime scene. The results were undeniable. Jason's DNA was found on several items, including gloves, as well as in the bag of illegal substances found in Lindsay's car. This evidence was crucial to the case and left no doubt about his involvement in the crime. Court transcripts showed that during the trial, Jason Lee did not plead guilty despite compelling evidence and witness testimony. He continued to insist on his innocence, claiming that his DNA may have gotten to the crime scene by accident. His defense tried to challenge the evidence, arguing that the blood and DNA traces could have resulted from other circumstances. However, the judge, considering all the evidence presented, did not accept these arguments. The trial lasted several weeks, and each day of the trial added more and more details to the picture of what had happened. However, during all this time, Jason failed to convince the court of his innocence, and all the charges against him were thoroughly analyzed and proved. In the end, the court came to a consensus. As a result of the court sessions on July 16, 2019, the Lexington County Court found Jason Lee guilty of the premeditated murder of his wife Lindsay Lee, as well as Level 1 burglary. The trial found that Jason Lee took advantage of his professional locksmith skills to enter Lindsay's home, where he attacked her, grabbed her throat with his hands, squeezed it, and used a knife to mutilate the victim's throat, before leaving her body in the bathroom, where she died from blood loss. The judge, after hearing all the evidence and considering the evidence, concluded that the crime was carefully planned. Jason Lee attempted to cover his tracks, including using gloves and planting illegal substances in the victim's car to make the robbery look like a robbery. Despite his attempts to exonerate himself, evidence including DNA evidence, witness statements, and investigative files left him with no way to escape accountability. On July 16, 2019, Jason Lee was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The court also noted that the defendant showed no remorse for his guilt and continued to insist on his innocence, despite clear evidence. This was a decisive decision for everyone involved in the trial, as it meant that the murderer was punished to the full extent of the law. Melissa Swiatek was born in 1985 in Indiana. Her childhood was spent in an ordinary working-class neighborhood where life flowed, measured, but not without difficulties. The girl early learned independence. Her parents worked a lot, and most of the time she spent with her grandmother. Being cheerful and sociable, Melissa easily found a common language with others. Clarence Justice, Melissa's age, was born in a neighboring town. He grew up in a large family of 5 children. His father worked as a mechanic and his mother worked part-time at a local cafe. In his youth, Clarence was not distinguished by special ambitions, but he was always a friendly person with a good sense of humor. They met Melissa in the early 2000s when they both worked at a local supermarket. Their relationship developed rapidly. Within a year, they started living together and then got married. In time, the couple had 3 children. The eldest son was born in 2004, the second child in 2006. The third, in 2007, was born Jada, a little girl with curly brown hair and a smile that could melt any heart. The parents did not care about their children, but domestic difficulties and financial problems gradually made themselves felt. Despite the warm feelings, the marriage of Melissa and Clarence did not stand the test. They often quarreled over money and childcare. Clarence wanted Melissa to spend more time at home, but she dreamed of building a career and not being tied to the household. As a result, the couple separated in 2008, and the children stayed with their mother. After the divorce, Melissa found herself in a difficult situation. 3 young children, lack of money, looking for a stable job. In this difficult period, her cousin Angelica Armstrong came to her aid. She offered to temporarily take her youngest daughter, Jada, to make life easier for Melissa when she needed to leave the city or to do important things. Her sister assured her that the girl would be fine, and Melissa agreed. That's how Jada ended up at the home of Angelica and her boyfriend Timothy Kachekik in Portage, Indiana. They were young people in their early 20s, leading ordinary lives and not standing out in any way. At first glance, they had a home and were willing to take care of the girl. June 16, 2009, a Tuesday, was overcast and rainy. The smell of wet asphalt was in the air. The puddles on the roads reflected the gray sky. In the morning, Angelica Armstrong went about her daily business as usual while Timothy was at home. In the afternoon, Angelica decided to go to the store. She needed to buy milk and a few other small things. She put 2-year-old Jada in the car, fastened her seatbelt, and drove to the nearest store. The store was nearby, only 5 minutes away. As Angelica parked outside the supermarket, the rain intensified. Not wanting to carry the baby in the downpour, she made the decision to leave her in the car. "I'll be quick," she thought, literally just for a minute, especially since the baby was already starting to fall asleep sitting quietly in the car seat. Angelica ran out of the car, closed the door, and hurried inside. The store was almost empty, shoppers hurrying to finish their business and go home. She grabbed some milk, some fruit, and headed to the cash register. After paying for her purchases, she went outside, covering herself with her hood from the rain. But as she walked to her car, her heart clenched. Jada was gone. Angelica stood frozen for a few seconds, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. She tossed her purchases on the seat and began to look around frantically. The car was locked, the windows unbroken. She looked under the seats, even though she knew perfectly well that it was pointless. The girl was nowhere to be found. With trembling hands, Angelica dialed 911. Her heart pounded, her breathing hitched, and her fingers shook so badly that she barely hit the right buttons. The operator's clear, calm voice came through the phone, but the words struggled to escape her lips. She tried to gather her thoughts, but panic came in waves. Her voice shook, her words were confused, but the point was clear. Her 2-year-old daughter was missing. Within minutes, the police arrived on the scene. The rain did not stop. Gray clouds hung over the city, giving everything even more ominous shade. Meanwhile, the rumor of the little girl's disappearance spread quickly down the street. Strangers who heard about the incident stopped nearby, trying to do something to help. The police immediately sprang into action. They interviewed witnesses, checked the nearby streets, and studied the surveillance footage. Angelika stood next to the car, her hands clenched tightly into fists. Her hair was wet from the rain, but she didn't notice it. One question pounded in her head: where was Jada? Within minutes of the 911 call, the first police officers arrived in the store's parking lot. Sirens cut through the sound of the rain, and flashing beacons reflected in the wet asphalt. 2 officers got out of their cars and walked briskly toward Angelika Armstrong, who stood by her car looking confused and nervous. The examination of the scene began immediately. The police scrutinized the car. The doors were closed, the windows were intact, there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. It seemed as if the child had simply disappeared into nowhere. The problem was that there were no eyewitnesses to the abduction. The weather had played its part. The rain had forced people to hurry their shopping and hide under store awnings. By the time Angelika noticed the girl's disappearance, there were only a few store employees and a few shoppers who had just arrived at the scene and witnessed the police work itself. No one had seen anyone kidnap the child. Realizing that time was of the essence, the officers called in the cinematologists with sniffer dogs. The hope was that even though it was raining, the dogs would be able to pick up the trail. While the patrolman interviewed possible witnesses, an officer escorted Angelika to a police car for a more detailed interrogation. The officers initially wrote off Angelika's anxiety and nervousness as stress, but as the interview progressed, they began to notice that her behavior went beyond the usual shock. She responded confusedly, frequently interrupted, raised her voice, and at one point even became aggressive. When asked how long she had been in the store, she first said 2 minutes, then corrected herself, maybe 5. When the police clarified whether she was sure that the girl was really in the car when she went shopping, the woman hesitated. She hesitated for a few seconds and then answered with obvious irritation, raising her voice sharply. However, there was uncertainty in her tone and her gaze darted from side to side. The policeman noticed this behavior but did not say anything, only glanced among themselves. When it was suggested that she go to the station for a more detailed conversation, the woman suddenly became angry. Her face turned red, her movements became abrupt, and her voice broke into a shout. She indignantly declared that this was a waste of time because instead of asking her questions, the police should be searching for the child. Her emotionality could be attributed to stress, but officers noted that the behavior did not exactly fit the typical reaction of a worried caregiver. The officers calmly but persistently explained that it was important to get as accurate a statement as possible in order to expedite the investigation. Seeing that resistance was only making the situation worse, the woman reluctantly agreed to drive to the station. Even on the road, however, she continued to behave nervously, occasionally rubbing her hands together and looking out the window with obvious concern. At the station, the woman's behavior continued to raise questions for the officers. She would freeze, staring at one point, then begin tapping her fingers irritably on the table, and then suddenly burst into violent emotion, accusing the police of inaction. When the decision was made to test for illegal substances, the results were unexpected. Psychotropic substances were found in Angelika's system. This explained her extreme mood swings and erratic behavior. Taking into account that the woman was under the influence of prohibited substances at the moment when she took a small child with her, it was decided to detain her. Initially, she was charged with negligence, leaving a child in dangerous conditions. In the evening of the same day the police officially announced Angelika's detention. The press quickly picked up the news, and local TV channels were already carrying the first reports on the mysterious disappearance of the 2-year-old girl. While the police were looking into the circumstances of the incident, Jada's relatives wasted no time. One of the girl's uncles was the first to appeal to the public to help in the search. He appealed to the local media to help in the search for the missing girl. His voice was shaking, and desperation was red in his eyes. He emphasized that every minute counted and urged anyone who knew anything to inform the police immediately. Over the next few days, hundreds of flyers were printed with Jada's image on them. They were posted around the city, distributed to stores, gas stations, and bus stops. Volunteers spread information on social networks, trying to attract the attention of as many people as possible. Local residents responded. Dozens of volunteers agreed to join the search, searching the neighborhood and forest belts. Cynologists with dogs combed the nearby areas, in the hope of finding at least a trace of the girl. Meanwhile, Jada's mother, Melissa Swiatek, was not immediately aware of the incident. She was out of town with her new young man at the time. She rarely contacted her relatives as her relationship with them had been strained lately. When she learned of the incident, she immediately returned to the city. But this fact raised questions for the police. Why was the mother out of contact for such an important time? The situation was getting more and more confusing. Each new fact that surfaced during the investigation only complicated the picture. Despite all efforts, the search in the first few days yielded no results. The dogs were unable to pick up a sure trail, probably because of the rain. The surveillance cameras outside the store did not record any suspicious movements near the car. No one in the neighborhood saw anyone dragging or carrying the child away. The only lead the police were hoping for was Angelica Armstrong. If she was telling the truth and really had nothing to do with the girl's disappearance, then Jada had been kidnapped by someone else. If she was lying, they had to find out why. The case promised to be complicated. It was unclear whether they were dealing with a kidnapping, an accident, or something much more disturbing. One thing remained the same. They had to find Jada as soon as possible. Hours after Jada Justice's disappearance, the first major twist in the investigation came. Cynologists with service dogs completed their work at the scene, and their conclusion was unexpected. The experts declared confidently there was no odor of the girl in the car. This meant that the child was not in the car at the moment Angelica Armstrong left it in the parking lot. The police responded to this information with special attention. If Jada was not in the car, it means that she disappeared not here but somewhere else. So, Angelica's story wasn't true. But for the time being, the detectives did not rush to conclusions, preferring to check all the versions. They decided to continue interrogating the suspect without informing her about the conclusion of the cinematologists. They were interested in who the girl was in contact with during the day, where and in whose company she was. Under the pressure of questions, Angelica mentioned one name, Tim Kachik. The police officers immediately went to the address provided. Tim's house was in the suburbs, in a remote neighborhood outside the city limits. It was an ordinary private house that did not stand out from the others. It looked dilapidated from the outside, but it did not arouse much suspicion. When the police went inside, however, they were confronted with a picture of utter chaos. There were overturned chairs, scattered clothes, dirty dishes, bags, scraps of papers, and old newspapers on the tables. The air was musty, smelling of a mixture of damp, sweat, and something chemical. Inspecting the rooms, the detectives discovered several disturbing details. In one corner of the living room were empty bottles, torn bags, and syringes, hinting at the frequent use of illegal substances. The bedroom was similarly unkempt. The sheets hadn't been changed for a long time, and there were traces of dirt and dust everywhere. But the strangest place was the bathroom. At first glance, it was no different from the rest of the room, but one detail immediately attracted the attention of the investigators. The bathtub was poured concrete. This fact seemed extremely suspicious. Why would someone want to fill the bathtub with cement? This does not seem like a standard repair, especially in a house that was clearly in disrepair. Police officers recorded the find and decided to conduct an on-site examination. While the investigation team was examining the house, the officers also found Tim himself. He was in one of the rooms, half undressed, in a semi-fainting state. He appeared to be under the influence of a highly addictive substance. His appearance was alarming to the police. He looked emaciated, his skin had a sickly tint, his eyes were sunken, and his face was covered with recent burns. One side of his face looked charred, the skin in those areas was rough and scarred. It gave him a frightening expression. He answered questions with difficulty, often confused, lost in thought. The officers tried to find out when he had last seen Jada, but his answers were incoherent, confused. He would say he had seen her in the morning, then claim he didn't know what child he was talking about at all. This behavior left the police in no doubt that he should be detained. They had already found illegal substances in the house, and the concrete tub raised too many questions. In addition, he was clearly intoxicated through the use of illegal substances, which made his behavior even more suspicious. Tim was taken into custody, and his home was declared the site of a detailed investigation. Experts were to chemically analyze the concrete and see if there was anything important underneath. Events began to develop in a new direction. If earlier the main attention was focused on the version of the abduction from the parking lot, now there was a possibility that the disappearance occurred long before that moment. Now the police had to find out what role Tkachuk had played in this, how he was connected to Jada, and why his house was in such a state. The search for the girl continued, but the situation was becoming more alarming by the hour. Following Tim Tkachuk's arrest, the police continued an in-depth investigation into his identity and activities. As they examined his connections and financial transactions, new details emerged that shocked even seasoned investigators. It turned out that he was not only a man with a criminal record, but also an active distributor of illegal substances. Moreover, from the collected evidence, it became clear that he used physical force against little Jada Justice. These facts changed the course of the case. Now it was not only kidnapping but also child abuse. The prosecutor's office quickly issued a preliminary charge that included possible murder. Given the nature of the crime, he faced the death penalty if proven guilty. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Tkachuk was faced with a difficult choice: either remain silent and risk capital punishment, or make a deal with the investigation. After several days of deliberation, pressured by irrefutable evidence, he decided to cooperate. The confession Tkachuk gave was not just shocking, it revealed a cruel, agonizing picture of the last days of the 2-year-old girl's life. According to him, it all started with constant abuse from Anglika Armstrong. The woman often snapped at Jada, hitting her, yelling, treating her as if she were a burden. Tim did not deny that he himself was also involved in the abuse of the child, but emphasized that it was his cohabitant who played a key role in the beatings. On one day, when the girl was particularly restless, Anglika used force on her to such an extent that she lost consciousness. Realizing that something terrible had happened, Armstrong and Tkachuk panicked. They tried to bring the girl to her senses using artificial respiration, but all was in vain. At this point, they realized that the child was dead. As they looked at each other, they realized that they were in a desperate situation. Calling the police meant an immediate charge of murder. There was nowhere to run. They decided to dispose of the body, hoping to cover up the crime. Weaver admitted that the original plan was to burn the body. He wrapped Jada in a blanket, put her in a bag, and drove her to the woods near the city. He took a flammable liquid with him and poured it over the child's remains. However, his plan did not include one thing. The chemical reaction was stronger than he had hoped. The arson was followed by a massive explosion. The flames flared too quickly. Tkachuk did not have time to move to a safe distance. His face was exposed to the heat, so he received burns that later disfigured his appearance. The fire was chaotic and failed to completely destroy the body. In panic, Tkachuk returned home, not knowing what to do next. After a failed attempt to destroy the evidence in the woods, when the fire resulted in an explosion and serious burns, Tkachuk realized the plan had failed. He returned home and told Anglika all about it. Now they faced a new task: to get rid of the body so that it would never be found. They decided to choose a radical method. In their opinion, the only way to hide the remains was to cover them with concrete. They chose the bathroom as the location, where they set up a makeshift sarcophagus. Using cement, they completely covered the girl's body to create a heavy monolithic structure. After the concrete had set, they planned to remove the block, take it to a remote swampy area, and drown it so that no one would be able to discover the remains. They hoped that the water and silt would make the concrete invisible, so the investigation would be a dead end. Weaver realized that further resistance was pointless. After fully confessing to the crime, he agreed to cooperate with the investigation and indicated the exact place where he tried to destroy the evidence. On June 24, 2009, an investigative team consisting of operatives, cinematologists, and criminalists went to the forest area he named. They combed the area thoroughly and quickly found traces of burning, charred fragments and tissue remnants. The evidence they found corroborated his testimony about his first attempt to dispose of the body with fire, which led to the explosion and the burns he received. The most important part of the confession, however, was the reference to the swamp where the body eventually ended up. Although the original plan was to hide the remains in the bathroom by pouring concrete over them, he and Angelique managed to remove the massive block from the house. They had succeeded in hiding it in a marshy area, hoping that way it would never be found. Now forensic investigators faced the daunting task of removing the concrete block from the marsh and performing an autopsy to officially confirm the location of the remains. It was a key moment in the investigation that could finally set the stage for the disappearance of Jada Justice. After opening the concrete block, investigators discovered the remains of a child. While the investigation continued to establish all the circumstances of the crime, another disturbing fact suddenly surfaced. During the investigation of Tim Kachik's connections, it became clear that Melissa Swiontek, Jada's mother, regularly purchased illegal substances from him. This information called into question her ability to be a responsible parent. If she was in contact with a man who had a criminal history and was associated with the distribution of illegal substances, then she was knowingly putting her children at risk. In addition, the investigators did not rule out that Melissa may have known more than she was telling because she entrusted her youngest daughter to people she did little or no vetting. This led to a serious discussion of terminating her parental rights. The court had to decide whether she should retain custody of her remaining children, given her neglect of their safety. After Kachik's confession and the discovery of new facts, the case took on a new ferocity. It was no longer just kidnapping, but premeditated murder, an attempt to cover up the crime and the abuse of illegal substances by adults who were supposed to be caring for the child. The investigation had to prove who exactly caused the girl's fatal injuries, how it happened, and to what extent each of the participants was guilty. One thing remained clear. The truth had finally come out, but the price was too high. The trial of Jada Justice caused a wide public outcry. The story of a 2-year-old girl who died at the hands of the people she was entrusted to shook the local community. Journalists closely followed the proceedings, and the public demanded fair punishment for those responsible. The trial was complex and emotionally intense. Prosecutors presented evidence of child abuse, cover-up, and manipulation by the defendants. The jury realized from the first days of the hearing that this case would leave no one indifferent. Angelica Armstrong tried to deflect responsibility from the beginning. She and her lawyer built the defense on the version that she did not know about the violence against the girl and did not participate in the murder. According to them, all the blame lay on Tim Kachik, who was allegedly the only person involved in the tragedy. The defense argued that on the day of the tragedy, Angelica was in a depressed emotional state and did not realize the magnitude of what was happening. According to her attorney, she helped Kachik dispose of the body out of fear and pressure, not of her own free will. But that theory quickly collapsed when prosecutors presented a key piece of evidence, an audio recording of their conversation made as part of Kachik's plea deal. Earlier, realizing the inevitability of punishment, Kachik had agreed to cooperate with the police, expecting a lighter sentence. During the investigation, a hidden microphone was attached to him, which was used to record his conversation with Angelica in the pre-trial detention cell. On the recording, Angelica was heard admitting that she had beaten the girl. She not only confirmed that she had beaten Jada, but also described in detail how it had happened. At one point, she even expressed regret that it resulted in death, but sounded annoyed rather than remorseful. This recording completely shattered Angelica's line of defense. The prosecution now had irrefutable proof of her guilt. During the investigation, a disturbing fact came to light. Melissa Swiatek, Jada's mother, regularly purchased illegal substances from Tim Kachek, a man with a criminal record implicated in her daughter's murder. This called into question her ability to be a responsible parent. The court examined the circumstances of the case in detail and concluded that Melissa had failed to exercise due care for her children. She entrusted Jada to people she barely knew without checking the conditions in which her child would be kept. Moreover, her regular contact with a trafficker of illegal substances indicated an irresponsible lifestyle. Throughout the investigation, by contrast, Clarence Justice, Jada's father, proved to be a caring and responsible parent. He assisted the investigation, participated in the search for his daughter, fought for the truth, and did everything he could to ensure that the perpetrators were punished. Taking all these factors into account, the court ordered Melissa's parental rights to be terminated. Custody of the 2 remaining children was awarded to Clarence Justice. He is now their sole legal guardian, and Melissa Swiatek is prohibited from having any contact with the children in order to safeguard their future. After much deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. It was harsh but fair. On July 19, 2013, the Indiana Circuit Court found Anglica Armstrong guilty of first-degree murder, cruelty to a child, concealing a body, and obstructing an investigation. She was sentenced to 65 years in prison without parole. On July 19, 2013, Timothy Kachek was found guilty of accessory to murder, destruction of evidence, unlawful possession of a controlled substance, and contributing to the cover-up of a crime. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Rhonda Casto was born on October 23, 1986 in Portland, Oregon, to Julia Simmons. From an early age, Rhonda was surrounded by her mother's love, but her life was not always cloudless. Despite her mother's best efforts, the family was not wealthy, and Rhonda knew from a young age that she would have to fight for her dreams. Rhonda was an ambitious but also sensitive and caring girl, which was combined with her desire for independence. As a teenager, she had a passion for fashion and dreamed of becoming a model, which was quite difficult in the small town she lived in. However, Rhonda always believed that if she worked hard, one day her dreams would come true. Rhonda attended the local high school, and although her studies were nothing special to her, she was actively involved in the school and dreamed of more. After graduating from high school, she did not go to university but decided to pursue a career in modeling and beauty. Realized that she needed to go beyond her hometown, but at that moment Rhonda did not know how to do it. However, her life changed dramatically in 2005 when her mother Julia rented a room in Stephen Nichols' apartment. At that time, Rhonda was still a young woman who lacked stability and confidence in the future. It was then that Rhonda met Stephen, and as she later told her friends, her jaw dropped when she first saw him. Stephen was 27 years old and 8 years older than Rhonda, but despite this age difference, there was an immediate strong attraction between them. Rhonda and Stephen began to spend a lot of time together, and soon their relationship became more serious. Their connection developed rapidly, and soon Rhonda and Stephen became a couple. It is important to note that their relationship was full of both passionate moments and conflicts. Stephen was more mature and experienced, while Rhonda was energetic and open-minded, which attracted him but also caused arguments at times. Problems in the relationship began to show when Rhonda gave birth to their daughter in 2008. Becoming a mother took her even deeper into caring for her family and her daughter. Rhonda was a wonderful mother. Her loved ones remarked how much she loved her baby girl and how carefully she cared for her despite her own worries and problems. Rhonda missed her former freedom, but she still stayed in the relationship, trying to make it work for her daughter's sake. Nevertheless, their relationship became more strained each year. Rhonda became increasingly vocal about her concerns about Nichols and his character. This was expressed in the words she once said to her best friend Jessica Colburn, "He's either going to propose to me or kill me." The phrase seemed to be said in jest, but amid their growing quarrels and resentment, her relationship with Stephen began to seem more troubling. On March 16, 2009, the couple decided to go on a hike to spend the day outdoors and perhaps refresh their relationship. Stephen suggested that Rhonda take a hike on the popular Eagle Creek Trail, which is a 45-minute drive from Portland. The place was famous for its natural beauty, but also for its dangerous terrain. Narrow sections of the trail with steep slopes and cliffs were known for accidents. Rhonda and Stephen hoped that the day would be a good day to spend time together, get some fresh air, and strengthen their bond. They decided that the hike would be an opportunity for them to take a break from their daily routine and strengthen their relationship, which had recently left much to be desired. On the day of the tragedy, the morning was fresh and clear, and it looked like everything was going to be fine. However, the weather soon changed. It began to rain, and gradually the conditions on the trail became more dangerous. The trail became slippery, especially in some parts where ice and snow covered not only the ground but also the rocks themselves. Stephen and Rhonda kept walking despite the rain and icy trail, for they did not expect this walk to end in tragedy. Rhonda jokingly threw a towel over her shoulders and pretended to be Supergirl, running down the trail despite the dangers that lurked in her path. At one point, she lost her balance and fell off the cliff before she could keep her footing. Stephen immediately called the police and medical help, reporting that his girlfriend had fallen off the cliff while hiking. The fact that he was with her at the time caught the attention of investigators, but at the time, no one could have guessed how complicated the investigation would turn out to be. The Eagle Creek Trail, located 45 minutes from Portland, Oregon, is one of the popular hiking spots among hikers. However, despite its beauty, it is known for its dangerous sections that have already caused several tragic incidents. The trail runs along the river and through its gorges. In some places it is very narrow and steep, with steep precipices that drop straight into deep abysses. Unusually scenic views, waterfalls, and verdant forests attract hundreds of hikers, but these sections of the trail also make the route extremely dangerous, especially for those who are unprepared or do not take into account the deteriorating weather conditions. On the day of the tragedy, March 16, 2009, the Eagle Creek Trail was experiencing variable weather that left nothing good for hiking. Things were relatively calm in the morning, but by the time Rhonda and Stephen began their hike, the weather began to deteriorate. It soon began to rain and the temperature dropped significantly. The snow that had not yet melted at the bottom of the trail mixed with the rain, turning the ground into an icy mass. In places, rocks and tree roots were slippery and the trail became dangerous, especially on steep inclines. Rhonda and Stephen kept moving forward despite the conditions without thinking about the consequences. However, the inexorable elements did take their toll. On one of the narrowest and most dangerous parts of the trail, Rhonda couldn't keep her balance and fell. The cliff was so steep that the fall was fatal. After Rhonda was at the bottom, Stephen immediately called emergency services, reporting that his girlfriend had fallen off the cliff while hiking. He tried to explain the circumstances of the accident, but there were some oddities in his story that later caught the attention of investigators. When the police and ambulance arrived at the scene around 6 p.m., they met with challenging conditions. The weather continued to deteriorate, with rain turning into a downpour and wind gusts getting stronger. Law enforcement and rescue personnel faced a real challenge. The trail was narrow and slippery, and the rain and fog limited visibility. Nevertheless, they were able to reach the scene of the fall about 40 minutes after the call. Rhonda's body was found at the bottom of the ravine, at the bottom of a steep cliff. Initial reports indicated that Rhonda was unconscious and in a lifeless state. The lack of signs of life immediately led officers to watch for possible evidence that she had not just fallen, but may have been subjected to some external force. No obvious signs of struggle or violence were found at the scene, which could support a theory of premeditated murder. Instead, police saw signs that Rhonda had slipped on a slippery and dangerous surface. Investigators began to scrutinize the scene. No footprints other than her own were found around Rhonda's body. The only noticeable element on the trail was a single trail leading directly to where she had fallen, as if Rhonda may have lost her balance at that exact spot and slipped off. Several details caught the investigators' attention. The shoe marks on the slippery trail were oddly placed, leading them to wonder if Rhonda might have been pushed or shoved at the moment she lost her balance. However, given the lack of other signs of violence or struggle, this theory has not been proven. The trail where the incident occurred was indeed dangerous, and not only locals but also officials were talking about it. There were rumors that there had been several accidents in the area in the past where people had fallen off cliffs. For example, in the same year, 4 people died as a result of falls from steep slopes in the area, including several accidents on nearby trails such as Eagle Creek. Rumor has it that these tragedies often occur on sections of the trail where the bluff drops into deep canyons. And in addition, it is often difficult to stay on the narrow and slippery surface. In the same year that the Rhonda tragedy occurred, police had already documented several accidents on the trail, which also impacted the investigation. This led investigators and experts to pay attention to possible features of the area, such as its natural characteristics. As noted by Hood River County Sheriff Matt English in 2009, the trail was very steep and narrow, and everything was pretty wet and slippery. There was also some snow in the parking lot area, which made the situation on the trail even more dangerous. After Rhonda's body was removed, investigators focused on analyzing her condition and the surrounding circumstances. Once down, she lay unconscious, and her body showed no obvious signs of injuries typical of falls from great heights, such as broken bones. However, it was important to understand whether her fall was the result of an accident, or perhaps it was triggered by some external influence. Stephen Nichols, in his own words, claimed that Rhonda went forward to overtake him when she slipped and fell off the cliff. Investigators pointed out several inconsistencies in Nichols' version. For example, the lack of other footprints on the trail in the area of Rhonda's fall, other than her own, raised doubts. Next, investigators continued to explore the possibilities that perhaps Rhonda could have been in some way forced or even pushed at that moment. Weather conditions and difficult terrain may have played a role in the incident, but it was also important to consider more subtle nuances, such as Stephen's behavior that day and his reactions to the incident. By the time the police reached the scene, the weather conditions had deteriorated even more. It was pouring rain, wind gusts had increased, and all attempts by investigators to move along the trail became increasingly difficult and dangerous. As the rain continued to intensify, several times during the investigation, local authorities stated that this weather may have been a deciding factor in what happened to Rhonda. Stephen Nichols was one of those people whose accounts of what happened changed more than once. When the tragedy first occurred, he claimed Rhonda's fall was an accident and didn't pay much attention to the strange questions she asked that day. But later, when Nichols agreed to be interviewed for the 48 Hours program, his story underwent a major change. Points that had previously been ignored or downplayed resurfaced, and his explanations began to sound unsettling and unclear, which only added to the doubts of investigators and the public. Stephen Nichols and Rhonda Casto went camping on March 16, 2009, according to Nichols, with the intention of spending time in nature, taking a break from everyday life and getting in shape. Rhonda, according to him, dreamed of regaining her former physical shape after giving birth. She had gained excess weight during her pregnancy, and Nichols suggested going on a hike so she could exercise and get back to her modeling career. According to him, the hike was just a way to maintain her health and get back to normal. However, for Rhonda, as it turned out, it wasn't just physical, but also psychological. Her thoughts and experiences that day were much more complicated. According to Nichols, the weather that day was perfect for the hike. According to him, he and Rhonda felt good and were in good spirits. He emphasized that his relationship with Rhonda was in a beautiful state at the time. This statement also raises questions, because other sources, including her best friend Jessica Colburn, said that their relationship had been difficult in recent months, full of arguments and resentment. On the day of the tragedy, Rhonda asked Stephen a strange and disturbing question several times that left him with an uneasy feeling. He claimed that she asked him twice, "If something happened to me, would you promise to take care of our daughter?" Stephen claimed that the question was strange, but he answered it by promising that he would take care of his daughter if anything happened. The question could have been simply an expression of Rhonda's care and concern, but it could also have meant something more, as if she already felt that her life might be cut short, a premonition of something. Rhonda's question turned out to be the very signal that may have gone unheeded. As time passed, and especially after Stephen Nichols was interviewed, his explanation became less definitive. He changed his version of the incident, claiming that Rhonda's fall was not just an accident, but could have been the result of her internal state. Nichols stated that Rhonda was suffering from depression, that she could have chosen that moment on her own to step off the trail and fall. This new account added confusion to an already conflicting picture of the accident. He claimed that there was a single footprint at the scene that supposedly could be evidence that Rhonda had taken a step toward the cliff, perhaps intentionally. This footprint claim caused the investigation to revisit the version of the accident. In addition, Nichols began to state that upon reaching Rhonda's body after her fall, he noticed that she may have still been breathing. He added that upon seeing her in such a state, he decided to help her. According to him, she was in severe agony and he tried to do what he thought was right in such a situation. This statement he made in the interview raised strong questions. Nichols began referring to Rhonda as a wounded soldier who supposedly had to be finished off because her injuries were too severe to save. And this comparison, not only bizarre but disturbing, became a source of renewed suspicion. Could it be that Nichols didn't just watch Rhonda's fall but was somehow involved in her death? Why would he make such a dangerous statement? This moment in the interview was interpreted as a possible confession to something much more serious. Subsequently, although Stephen claimed that his account in the interview was an attempt to explain the strangeness of the day, his words only served to complicate the picture for investigators. After all, as Rhonda's mother, Julia Simmons, claimed, her daughter could not have voluntarily passed away. She was on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, but there was no indication that she could have been set up for such an act. Julia, certain that her daughter could not have made such a choice, claimed that Nichols was lying. She claimed that he was the one who pushed Rhonda off the cliff and then tried to give investigators the impression that Rhonda's death was an accident. According to Julia, Stephen's behavior was not only strange, but suspicious. Investigators began to wonder what really happened that day. The theory that Rhonda might have decided to walk off the trail on her own was confounded by additional evidence collected at the scene. In addition, Stephen's accounts, which at first seemed plausible, soon began to become increasingly doubtful. He repeatedly changed his explanations, and his original version, in which he referred to Rhonda's fall as an accident, now sounded unconvincing when he himself began talking about footprints and Rhonda possibly still alive. The details revealed in the interview continued to raise questions and uncertainty about the veracity of his claims. Was it a mere coincidence that Rhonda was asking such strange questions about caring for his daughter hours before the fall? What did his words mean that she might still be alive when he got to her body after all? Why did Nichols compare her to a wounded soldier? And what did he mean by the help he supposedly gave Rhonda at that moment? These questions remained unanswered, but they also confirmed that the whole story was far more convoluted than it initially appeared. Rhonda's mother, Julia, was adamantly opposed to the idea that the version of voluntary abandonment or accidental death could be accepted as true. To her, it was absolutely impossible. She was certain that her daughter could not have left in such a way, especially with a small child in her arms. Initially, the case of Rhonda Casto's death was ruled an accident, and the theory that her death was caused by an accidental fall seemed plausible. Stephen Nichols, during the initial interviews and investigation, claimed that Rhonda's fall from a cliff on the popular Eagle Creek Trail was a tragic accident caused by slippery conditions and bad weather. He recounted how he and Rhonda decided to spend the day outdoors, and that the fall occurred when she slipped and was unable to keep her balance on the slippery trail. All of this, he said, was an accident, and their relationship was in a good place at the time. Local authorities, following these allegations, concluded that the tragedy was the fault of natural conditions, and there was not enough evidence to consider Rhonda's death a homicide or a voluntary departure from life. However, over time, and under pressure from new circumstances and repeated statements made by Rhonda's mother, Julia Simmons, the case was reconsidered. Julia Simmons, Rhonda's mother, remained deeply convinced throughout the investigation that her daughter could not have voluntarily passed away. She maintained that Rhonda was full of life, cared for her daughter, and had no intention of taking her own life. Simmons insisted that her daughter could not have jumped off the cliff as Stephen Nichols had suggested, and that she had been pushed to do so. For several years, Julia continued to insist on her opinion, claiming that Nichols was responsible for Rhonda's death. When, after a time, the investigation resumed again, new evidence and testimony led to the creation of a grand jury to decide whether Stephen Nichols should be indicted. This decision was based on circumstantial evidence that began to emerge after Stephen's initial version of the accident. The key factors that led investigators to reconsider the case were repeated changes in Nichols' story, as well as oddities in his behavior after the accident. One of the most bizarre and disturbing was his claim that Rhonda asked him some unusual questions that day before she fell off the cliff. She asked in his words, "If something happened to me, would you promise to take care of our daughter?" This statement perplexed investigators, and they began to suspect that Rhonda may have had a premonition of something bad, or perhaps was already in a dangerous situation. In addition, his strange behavior after Rhonda's fall, particularly the claim that she may have still been alive when he reached her body, did not add credence to his stories. As more evidence and facts began to surface, the police decided to conduct a new investigation. This led to the creation of a grand jury to take a closer look at the case and decide if an indictment should be filed. In April 2014, the decision was made to indict Stephen Nichols for murder. That charge was filed as a secret indictment, which investigators said was based on new evidence, testimony, and analysis that could not be fully released to the public. On February 12, 2015, Stephen Nichols was arrested at the San Francisco airport while returning from a trip. His reasons for being at that airport remained unclear, and at the time his arrest was unexpected and shocking to many. He was arrested on charges of the murder of Rhonda Casto, and it soon became clear that he was facing a serious trial. Under the new charges, he faced a sentence of 25 years to life in prison if proven guilty in court. After his arrest, Stephen Nichols was taken into custody and was held in jail for 15 months until his trial began. This time became extremely difficult for him, as he was accused of murdering the woman he once shared his life with. While Stephen and his defense argued that he was innocent, Rhonda's mother continued to insist that Nichols was responsible for her death. She claimed that he pushed her daughter off the cliff, and her voice grew more and more determined and louder, demanding justice for her daughter. Stephen's time in prison was also a time for a new wave of public interest in the case. Many people who had been following the investigation continued to discuss versions of what had happened on the trail, and everyone had their own take on what might have happened. However, each new statement from Nichols, each change in his version of the incident only added to the confusion of this already confusing case. After months of waiting and accusations, the trial against Stephen Nichols began. The prosecution claimed that Stephen Nichols was responsible for the death of his girlfriend, Rhonda Casto, who died in March 29 when they were hiking the Eagle Creek Trail. The trial was a colorful and tense affair that drew attention not only from locals but also from the general public. Investigators and prosecutors argued that despite initial claims of accident and a fall due to a slippery surface, new evidence had been uncovered that pointed to a possible murder. This evidence, including oddities in Stephen's behavior after the incident and his conflicting testimony, became the basis for the charges. During the trial, Nichols' defense insisted that the tragedy was indeed an accident and that all charges against him were unfounded. They argued that Rhonda may have suffered from depression, which may have led to her decision to take her own life. The defense also focused on the fact that no obvious signs of violence were found at the scene, and that Rhonda could have slipped and fallen due to weather condition. However, prosecutors argued that Nichols' actions after the accident, his changes in his story, and his bizarre statements that Rhonda may have still been alive after the fall raised serious doubts about his version of events. In addition, the evidence provided by Rhonda's mother, Julia Simmons, that her daughter could not have committed suicide became an important element in the case. Julia continued to maintain that Stephen Nichols was guilty and that he pushed her daughter off the cliff. An important point in the trial was to focus on Nichols' mental state, his behavior on and after the day of the tragedy, and the strange questions Rhonda asked him before her fall. Rhonda's questions about whether Stephen would take care of his daughter if something happened to her, were an additional factor that cast doubt on the sincerity of his accounts. After a thorough investigation, analyzing all the evidence and testimony provided, the judge and jury were forced to make a decision. On September 16, 2016, the Hood River County Court found Stephen Nichols guilty of criminal reckless homicide of Rhonda Casto and coercion. The court found that Nichols' actions, including his changing statements and erratic behavior after the tragedy, were sufficient to convict him of Rhonda's death. Despite the lack of clear physical evidence of violence, investigators and prosecutors were able to argue that Rhonda's version of an accidental fall did not hold up, given all the circumstances. On October 2, 2016, Stephen Nichols was sentenced to 15 months in prison, which he had already spent in custody, and was also sentenced to 3 years of probation with a mandatory behavioral control program and psychological rehabilitation. The court found his actions criminal, although it did not conclude that he directly committed murder with intent. Instead, he was found guilty of criminal reckless homicide, meaning that Rhonda's death was caused by his negligence and inattention rather than an act of premeditated violence.